Hello. How's that sound for audio? Oops. Hi everyone, welcome. So I've got the game going on in the background. Yeah, I think that'll work. So hopefully you're hearing me okay and seeing my desktop setup so I can show different parts of the lesson plan. I'm going to take my headphones off because the audio seems like it's balanced okay. And I should mention that my uh, Twitch chat information is on a screen over to my right, so I'll try to periodically check. I kind of have to rotate to see it, but I'll periodically check for chat messages or other questions if folks have them. Um, okay, so let's dive in. This is the first in a series that I'm calling Lessons with Jules. The idea behind this is just to talk about the principles of flying, kind of go through the entire private pilot and then later the commercial pilot, ACS, the Airman Certification Standards. We'll talk a little bit more about what that is as we get further in. I am a real life flight instructor, and I'm very excited to work with all of you on learning some of these things. I will say that the remote and simulator version of these is not the best way to go about learning. It's a good kind of intro to some of these topics, and it's definitely a lot of fun. But if you're interested in getting involved in aviation, if you want to go get your pilot's license, I highly encourage it. But I also highly encourage you to do a demo flight at your local airport. Most airports will have an instructor or maybe a club or a school that you could go and take a 1 or 2 hour demo flight just to kind of learn the basics. And today, actually, what we're doing is essentially the syllabus for one of those demo flights. So this is maybe a little more extensive than you would get in a standard demo flight. We'll go for about 2 hours, depending on how content and time goes through. I'm big on not dragging things on, so if we get through everything in under 2 hours, then we'll end a little bit early. But if you do go for a demo flight, which I think is a great idea, it'll probably be about 45 minutes or an hour. A lot of just going up in the air, practicing flying, and things like that. All right, just looking over at the chat. Yep, for sure, I'll go. Happy to. All right, so one of the things, so all my notes are also on my other screen. I'll kind of briefly explain the setup I'm working with. So when there's weird sort of back and forth audio things, it'll make a little more sense. So I have a MacBook hooked up to my iPad on one side of me, and then 90 degrees to my right, I have my throttle quadrant and my yoke connected to my Windows machine that's actually streaming out to Twitch. But because the monitors are at 90-degree angles, the audio is sort of like every time I turn my head, it gets a little distant. So sorry about that. Goes to a general point, which is there's a couple of bugs I'm still working through. One of those is I tried to get cameras set up for today, and it is a pretty big pain in the butt. So that'll be something that I work on for future lessons, especially for ones where I want to be able to show my own controls a little better so you can see what I'm doing. Today I'll just do my best to show in the sim when we actually go flying. Let me see. Hi, Milo. Hey, shoots, that's awesome. I actually did my demo flight at Flying Cloud, as it turns out. This was a birthday gift from my wife many years ago. So I'm originally from Minnesota. I did my CFI training in South St. Paul, which is also a great little airport. Flying around the Twin Cities area is really, really wonderful. So you're in for a treat. I'm glad to hear that. All right, sorry, just looking at my script again, make sure I don't miss anything. Oh yeah, this is important. So you may already know I'm based in the Bay Area. So on my iPad here, you can see we're flying out of Palo Alto. This is my kind of home airport, and typically where I fly from. So we're in this part of the world. And I'll base most of my lessons here around there unless there's a reason we should go elsewhere because there's something interesting to talk about there. One thing that's happening in the Bay right now is that there are really pretty crazy winds going on. Actually, I can try and show. This is Preflight, the app that you're seeing on the screen. Let me try and show this wind while I'm talking about it. So there's some pretty crazy winds coming across the bay at the moment. And so the actual airport is close. So there's that like 60 knot winds. I mean, that's pretty nuts. So no one's out flying today. You can see in the intro it was kind of crummy at the airport. That was live weather going on. The consequence of that, though, is that there is a non-zero chance that my part of the bay loses power. So if I suddenly disappear in the middle of the live stream, you know what's going on. The other thing that's good to know is because of that, my wife is also work from home, and we are currently fostering two puppies and have our own 2-year-old dog. So there's a non-zero chance that there's just noises going on around the house. It's the work from home lifestyle I think folks kind of get now. So. Okay, got it. Shoots, okay. Makes sense. Very cool. Yeah, so I host a fly-in on Tuesday nights, and so Shoots is saying that he was using a different username in the flight for yesterday. So that's awesome. Well, thanks for joining. Good to see you. All right, looking back at my kind of intro topics. Oh, so one of the other things to mention, lessons do build on one another. So you'll see that in my lesson plan here, I have this builds on section. Of course, the first lesson doesn't build on anything in particular. That's the first lesson. But in the future, there'll be topics, kind of like the blocks of learning approach, where you pick up each individual block, and then once you get those basic skills down, then you kind of layer on new skills and augment your understanding. I will try to do these live streams so that even if you tune in for just a random one in the middle of it, that you still get something valuable and hopefully useful out of it. But know that in a full syllabus, the idea is that you work lesson through lesson, and also your instructor will work with you at your pace to make sure that you're understanding things as you go. So there's a couple of really key parts of being a flight instructor that are being left out of this. One of them is, asking questions of the students, trying to understand what their understanding of the topics are, and then helping them build out those fundamental blocks before moving on to the next one. Because it's sort of just a presentation style and it's not a one-on-one teaching, I'll just kind of go at what I hope is a reasonable pace. And unfortunately, that means that we don't get that back and forth dialogue that's really, really useful for real-world flight instruction. If you do have questions, though, that come up, things that I either went too quickly through or you would want more information on, feel free to post in the Twitch chat and I will take a look. I'll try and periodically check it to make sure I'm answering any questions as I go. You can also always message in the Discord, which is linked from my Twitch about page. So if you go on the Jules Altus Twitch and then look at about, of the Discord link there. And you can always post questions there. I'm happy to answer anything that comes up. Yeah, but if you do end up tuning for a random lesson in the future, hopefully you get something valuable out of it. I will keep in mind that folks may be jumping on for the first time in however long. And so kind of make it, at least so that you can pick up some things that you'd want to turn around and apply to your own sim flying or real world flying if you're working on your license. All right, and that I think is all I had for intro stuff. I do see that I have a promotional chat in there, so I'm going to attempt to do my own moderation on this and kick off whoever that is. Let me see if I can get that to work. Just a second. All right. Hopefully that worked. When I had hosted the Twitch stream in the past, I did about 2 years ago, I was doing some live streaming of national park flights. And I had a good buddy of mine who was doing the moderator tasks. So I'm a little rusty on how those all click together. I'll try and get a bot set up in the future so that we can just filter those out. Yeah, Elgo, the weather on windy.com. I mean, it's really really pretty nuts. Yeah, you can hear the plants outside are all shaking, and we just brought everything inside to kind of batten down the hatches a bit. We don't really get weather like that around here very often. All right, well, let's dive in. So today's lesson is introductory flight, demo flight you might hear it called, including pre-flight, taxiing, and post-flight procedures. So the objective for today is to develop skills associated with preparation for safe flight, including pre-flight inspection, engine starting, taxiing, before takeoff check, tie down, and securing aircraft. So essentially today we're going to talk about the key content before you go flying and after you go flying. And then in the middle of the lesson today, we'll do a 45-minute just sort of fun flight around the bay. And this is one of my favorite ones to do actually when guests come to town. If it were a real first demo flight in the bay, we would probably stay a little bit closer to the airport and just focus on some of the more fundamental things because the airspace is a little bit complicated to be doing as a demo flight. But since we're in the sim, we can kind of ignore the airspace for this first flight, and we'll go fly around the Golden Gate Bridge and kind of come back. In the real world, you have a little bit more rules before you go do something like that. But for today, we can just have some fun and go fly downtown San Francisco. Okay, I'll leave this open. A couple references that are useful to know. The POH, the Pilot's Operating Handbook. So this is the operating handbook for the plane we're going to be using. Will be in a Cessna 172. If you go online and search Cessna 172 SP, which is the specific model that we're on, POH, then you'll get a list of instructions. It should look something like this. So if you find something that's sort of like that, then you're more or less in the right place. They have a better version that's kind of a digital one. Let me see if I have that one actually. I think this is it. Yeah. So this is the Cessna did an updated version. That's kind of a nice, I think they call it a reissuance or something like that. The other references here, the ACS, this is the Airman Certification Standards that I talked about. So you can Google private pilot ACS, and this is essentially what the FAA expects you to be able to do as a private pilot or as a commercial pilot. The West Valley Flying Club member regulations, if you were working with me at the flying club that I typically fly out of, this would be an important part of the discussion. We might talk a little bit about this because a lot of these are common sense, sort of like just good advice that maybe the FAA doesn't require, but you should be doing anyway. But for now, I kind of gloss over it. This is the Airplane Flying Handbook, and specifically chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, chapters 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. It seems like a lot. These are kind of the fundamental chapters of how to fly, and since this is sort of an intro to everything flight, it just hits on a lot of topics. In reality, you don't have to have pre-read any of these things for this flight because it's just the first one. But as we get more into it, I highly recommend reading through the AFH and the PHAC. These are both really, really good resources put out by the FAA, and they'll become really important as you get more into the details of flying. You also, if you're strongly considering, especially getting a real world license, you probably want to do some sort of ground school. I'll cover the basics of some of these topics, but ground school will go more in depth on, like, for instance, the theory or the why behind a lot of these things, whereas I'll try to keep it a little bit more practical to how to actually apply those pieces of knowledge and how to be a proficient pilot. In lesson 2, so I have the complete syllabus here, when we get into the 4 fundamentals of flying, in theory, at that point, you're probably interested in flying and you want to go and do a ground school. So I have a little bit in that lesson about choosing a ground school. But for now, just sort of the fun stuff. Okay, like I said, builds on nothing. Quick check my chat here. Okay. All right. The schedule for today, so we'll do ground for about an hour, flight for about an hour. Like I said, I'm not someone who tries to drag out topics to fit the time. So if we end early, that's great, especially since we don't have to like walk out to the plane or walk back from the plane. There's little bits of time that may get trimmed off from a more standard lesson. But I do plan, or at least my time is budgeted from 11 to 1, so a 2-hour live stream today. And I'll try and do about 45 minutes of ground, about 45 minutes of flight, and then 30 minutes of buffer-ish is sort of what I'm thinking. All right. So any other questions before we get started, feel free to post in the chat. Otherwise, we can start diving into the lesson elements. Looking over, okay. I had a professor in college who was really big on pausing to let people digest before they jumped on to the next topic. And so I was a program manager in a past life. And so I used to host these meetings, and then I would very, very slowly drink from my water bottle and just sort of wait. And then eventually, usually someone comes up with something to like, oh, actually, this is sort of in the back of my head, or I was trying to figure it out. Some people are really good at just getting the question out there without needing to think about it too much. Other people, it takes a moment to form. So anyway, also there's the chat delay. So all right, I think I've given a little bit of time here. Of course, always feel free to ask in Discord if anything else comes up. Twitch chat for the live stream, and then Discord for after the fact. Okay, so we're going to have kind of 5 key components of the lesson elements, 5 key parts of the lesson today. Really 4: the pre-flight, the taxiing, the before takeoff check, and the post-flight procedures. The way I'm going to do this to keep it interesting is to kind of go back and forth between Microsoft Flight Sim and the lesson plan. So hopefully, do like this. Hopefully that works. I have a boom mic set up, so I'm sort of swinging it back and forth, and hopefully it doesn't get to be too much audio adjustment. But we'll work out the bugs later. All right, so first, pre-flight. Let me make sure my audio all sounds good. It's good to pause for between main topics. Thanks, Shoots. Yep, totally. I feel pretty strongly about that, actually. The other thing that I'm really keen on is if you're gonna ask for big input from like a group, or if there's some big decision, that people get 24 hours to think on it, because otherwise you end up in situations where people who think more quickly are making all of those key decisions, when really what you want is the best ideas. And sometimes that means people who need more time to process, like just having 24 hours means you're getting better ideas across the whole group. So anyway, okay, so pre-flight. So one of the key things we'll talk more about when we get into some of the risk assessment things, but it's important to pre-flight the pilot as well. So there's an I'm safe checklist that you'll occasionally see, and this is one that I particularly like. So the idea behind I'm safe is, sorry, let me step back a little bit. So pre-flighting is all about making sure that we've checked everything we can about the flight that we're about to do and make sure that it's safe to go. And so part of that is we'll go and check the aircraft, we'll check that we have the fuel, we'll check the weather, that sort of stuff. But an important aspect that people sometimes forget is that you also need to pre-flight the pilot. So the person who's controlling the aircraft is a key part of the safety of the whole system. So to do that, one checklist, and probably the most famous checklist that you'll see, is I'm safe. So this is about checking 6 different things about the pilot to make sure that there's nothing that's going to be problematic for the flight. It's sort of a like self-reflection on how you're doing at the time. So the first one on here is illness. Illness would be like, it's about like your physical health. Are you ill? Do you have some sort of like recovering from a cold maybe, or something like that that might impair your ability to fly? Sort of related to that, but sometimes it can be a different reason, is medicine. So certain types of medication can impair your ability to fly. A really common one that can be, or one that you may come across more frequently and you're not legally allowed to fly after taking for a certain amount of time, is Benadryl. And so there's a really good, sorry, before I jump into the resource. So the idea behind this is that certain medicines will inhibit your ability to fly in different ways. And so the FAA's guidance is that for particular types of medicine, they approve or they approve with caveats different types. So, for instance, if you have taken Benadryl, you have to wait 60 hours after the last dosage. Oops, let's see if I can highlight here. So, I'll just pop this open. This is an important topic. So you have to wait 60 hours after last having Benadryl. And it has to be kind of an occasional use thing. This is an important one, especially for someone like me who's allergic to cats. So if I need Benadryl for, like I'm going over to someone's house and they have a bunch of cats, I just no longer take Benadryl, which is sort of a pain. But if I did take it, I would need to wait 60 hours before I could go flying again, which is not worth the trade-off in my mind. So I usually just kind of rough it out. Dayquil is 12 hours to wait before flying. Aspirin, it sort of depends on the symptoms being treated. Dramamine, you're not allowed to have at all. So this is important. Dramamine's for motion sickness. So this is something, if we were going for a real first flight, this would also be something I'm feeling out is how are you as the potential pilot doing with the motion of the plane. And then there's a bunch of other good resources here on what medicines are or aren't allowed. If you're someone who's interested in these sorts of things, AOPA put out a really good medications database, and it just includes kind of what the medicine is, what the FAA's guidance is on it, and anything else about it that like sort of side effects and things like that. Highly recommend checking this out if you just are curious about it. Okay, so illness medicine. So stress is about like life stress or other kinds of stressors that might impair your ability to operate the aircraft, things that may be distracting you or otherwise impair your ability, especially judgment for flying. Alcohol is a pretty big one. Okay, thanks, Shoots. Just checking out the chat, make sure I didn't miss anything. Alcohol is a big topic, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but in short, you have to wait 8 hours after your last drink, and you have to have a blood alcohol of less than 0.04. The reason it's not zero, according to my first flight instructor, was and he had been working with a doctor and sort of asked him, and the answer he got back was that the body will naturally have some amount of alcohol that's just produced from the natural biological processes. And so if you measured someone's blood alcohol content, you're probably not going to get zero, even if they haven't been drinking at all. And so they put it at like slightly above zero, but nominally it's essentially zero. And the key part about that is waiting 8 hours then before you fly. Regardless of how much you've had to drink, you have to wait 8 hours. Fatigue is the next one. This is about maybe you haven't been getting enough sleep, or maybe you've been getting poor sleep, those sorts of things. I know for myself, my worst flying days were always days when I got insufficient amounts of sleep. And it got to the point when I was working on my commercial certificate where, because I'm kind of an 8 hours sleep each night kind of person. And it was interesting because any night, if I didn't get 8 hours of sleep, my instructor could almost always point it out, because my ability to land on a point and some of the other things you need to do for the commercial maneuvers would pretty dramatically diminish. So obviously fatigue impacts everyone differently, but it's something you should be checking in for the pilot. I'm checking my time and making sure I'm not going on too long about this. Eating and emotion. Have you eaten recently? This is sort of one interpretation of the E. The other one you'll often hear is emotion. Is there anything that's may make you unsafe to fly because of some big emotional load in your life, or might make you make reckless decisions, would be another way to put it. Okay, so that's the I'm safe checklist. Doing a quick time check on myself here, and I'm going to move through this a little bit quicker, also because it's meant to be sort of an intro, and we'll touch on all these topics again as we really get into it, as we really get into the rest of the lessons. So the next piece on here is about weather and temporary flight restrictions. So now I get to go to my iPad here. And for weather, there's a great website that you can use called 1-800 wxbrief.com. So if you ever want to do your own pre-flight briefing, if you're going to do maybe live weather flight in Microsoft Flight Sim, this is a great resource. It is all available free, although I believe you need to make an account. So let me just do sign in here. And essentially what this is going to give you is, so I made a plan for, actually I made this for when the flight was going to be yesterday. So let me change this to today. I don't know why my iPad says Tuesday, January 9th. Okay, well that's incorrect, but that's okay. So if you go, you can type in all the information about this. These are reasonable, just sort of ballpark things for what we're going to be doing. We're leaving from Palo Alto, the departure date and time, the time zone, cruising at about 100 knots, level at about 3,000 feet. And then I'm saying that we're flying over to Oakland and then landing at San Carlos. Those are just roughly to give me a flight path that goes around the bay, so I can get a sense of the weather that's going on in our local area. Oops. Flight rule, VFR, visual flight rules. So that means we have to be able to see the ground. Sort of. Not technically, but it would be a little reckless to go if you couldn't see the ground. Really, it's about your proximity to clouds, which we'll talk more about a little bit later. Okay, and then there's just a bunch of settings for what you want for information. Okay, let's see if this works. Typically this is not quite so. There we go. Okay, great. TFRs are temporary, so while this is loading, TFRs are temporary flight restrictions. You'd also get this in your weather brief here. So there's that flight path that I plugged in. It just tells you information about kind of what's going on with the weather. We're going to talk more about this in future lessons, so I'm not going to spend much more time on it, but just to be aware that this resource exists. I've already done a pre-flight or a weather brief for this flight and can confirm that it is a really bad day to go flying. So we're going to change the weather to clear skies in the sim and just enjoy the fact that we don't need actual good weather to go flying in the simulator. The only one I'll mention is temporary flight restrictions. So these are things like if the president is in town, they might put a temporary restriction on where you're allowed to fly. Or if there's a big sporting event going on, then they might put a flight restriction around the stadium. And so this is saying that there's no temporary flight restrictions, which is nice. I typically use ForeFlight, which is an app I really like for this sort of thing. And so if I go TFRs and ForeFlight, kind of zoom out and see. All right, so there's a little bit of a TFR down here. But I'm sorry, this is a NOTAM, not a TFR. But if I go back maybe out to, we can usually find where the president is. Okay, he's probably here. All right, well, when he's in DC, it's sort of a different set of things. Let's see how this goes. Yeah, well, anyway. Okay, so those are what flight restrictions look like on ForeFlight. Walk around inspection, use of checklists. So next thing we'll talk about is how you actually inspect the airplane. Sorry, every time I pause like that, I'm sort of turning around, make sure there's no one on the chat. So the walk around inspection and the use of checklists. So we're going to walk around and check out the different aspects of the plane, make sure that everything looks safe to fly, essentially. This different systems all look correct, and nothing seems out of place. And we'll talk about what specifically we're looking at for each of the different areas as we go around. In the POH, that resource that I mentioned earlier, if you go to section 4, it'll actually talk about how to do the pre-flight inspection, including Cessna has a recommendation for how you should walk around it. So I'll do this in the sim. I'll actually go in the drone mode in the sim and kind of walk through what I'm looking at. And the nice thing about this is it's sort of a concept that we'll talk a lot about, which is a flow. So it's a way of using either the instrument panel or the plane itself to remember the series of things that you need to check as you walk around. And so Cessna's presenting this flow, start at one kind of outside the pilot door, walk around and checking various parts of the plane. They also then have a full checklist, which is all of the things that you need to make sure you've done specifically itemized out. And this is a good way, especially as you're first learning, you can go and just follow each individual item of the checklist to make sure you haven't missed anything. And that's what I'd recommend, especially as you're getting used to using these checklists, is you can kind of think of it as more of what you might hear called a do list. So just doing each item as you go through. And that's how these first couple of flights will kind of be, as a little bit more of a do list. Once we get further along, then we'll start to use it more as a checklist. And what I mean by that is that you'll use the flow of walking around this aircraft and then use the checklist to just check that you've done everything that you needed to do as you walked around. Okay, so we are currently in Palo Alto. There's where on the airport we are. Let's dive into the sim real quick and do our pre-flight. Yeah, let's do that. I'll go. The Vision Jet has a walk around thing, like a flow in the POH. Go like this. It's down. Okay. All right, here we are in the sim. Take my headphones off before so I'll put the headphones on every time to check the audio sort of makes sense. But having that feedback is always a bit much. Yep, in the manual, the list of things to check and all that stuff. Oh, very cool. That's awesome. I love when they do that kind of stuff. I'm actually surprised more of the planes don't come with good POHs. Ah, thanks, Milo. All right. So step one is to get the drone mode set up here. It's connecting to the controller. Oh no! All right, just a moment. Flip back to the Mac. All right, the flight sim needs to reload. When I tried to connect my Xbox controller to it to control for drone mode, it kicked out on me. So, all right, we'll let that reload real quick. One thing I can talk a little bit more about in the interim is fuel sampling and fuel level. There's a couple of really good videos on this. Because in the Microsoft Flight Sim we can't actually do it, I did want to play just a minute of what this looks like, so you have some frame of reference for what you would do when you do this. So while we're doing the walk around inspection, one of the last things we'll do is then go and check fuel level and also sample the fuel. What we're looking for essentially is, one, do we have enough fuel for the flight that we're going to be doing? And then the second thing is, are there any contaminants in the fuel, such as water or sediment or anything else that seems off? We also check that the fuel type is correct, and you'll see that in the video. For the Cessna 172, we expect it to be a blue fuel. So let me play this video, and this is just to show you how that sampling is done. I'll kind of jump ahead here. So you climb up on the Cessna just like that. Yep, and then you twist off this cap, and you notice that it says the fuel avgas only, and the grade of fuel that you can use is either 100 low lead, which is what most airports have, or it'll be getting the sim moving again, or it'll be maybe 100. I've never seen the green 100 fuel, but that's 100 low lead is what we're looking for, this blue fuel. Okay, so he's looking in there and he's determining the height of the fuel in the tanks. There's a sort of rim that you'd be able to see in the tank that indicates that you have a certain amount of fuel already in there. Let me see if they have a better angle at all. Yeah, not really. See if I can get this Yeah, that's right. Um, but inside of the tank, there's a sort of rim that gives you one indication of how high the fuel is if it's not full tanks. Otherwise, if it's all the way up at the top, then you would know that it's full fuel. So those are the two sort of built-in indications of fuel level. If the fuel is at a level that is not specifically at that marked level in the tank or at the very top, you can use a dipstick. You just sort of stick it in and then put your thumb over the top, lift it out, and it'll tell you how much fuel is in the tank. Okay, so this is him. Again, he's looking inside, checking that they have enough fuel. Good. Next thing he's doing is he's going to each of these fuel sumps, and he's pushing into it using this fuel collector and strainer. And essentially what it does is this releases fuel from the tank and then allows you to check if there's any water or if there's any sediment in the fuel. There's, depending on the aircraft, some number of these sumps. The Cessna 172 has 13 of them, and we'll go and try and find them in the sim. I actually haven't checked if they're rendered, so I'll be curious if we can find them or not. In the Piper Archer, the other plane I fly a lot, there's only 3, and the difference is that Cessna found that there were low points in the fuel tanks kind of all along the wing. So whereas the Archer only has a single low point in the tanks where water would collect, the Cessna 172 has potentially 5 different points in the tanks where water might collect. So that's why there's so many of these things. So he's putting it in the fuel sampler, and now what he's doing is he's looking at the color of it, and he's also looking at the bottom to see. Do you see my notes? Oh yeah, you do. Great. So he's looking in the bottom to see if there's any water that's separated out. So water is more dense than the fuel, and so you would see a little clear bubble beneath the blue fuel if there were water in there. He's also checking for sand or other things like that. So in this case, it looks good. And then you take it back up and you can pour it back in the tanks, assuming there's no contaminants in the fuel. Okay, so that is fuel sampling. This video, Aircraft Systems, is really great. So if you want to watch this whole thing, it talks about the fuel system in general. It's a pretty nice overview. All right, let's go back to Palo Alto. There are a lot of new. Yeah, yeah, Elgo. The POH is, it's interesting to hear. Sometimes pilots will start flight instruction in really complicated aircraft, and there's a number of reasons why that can be kind of a tricky thing to do about the actual flying of the plane. But as far as the instruction manuals and actually trying to understand the POH, like the nice thing about a Cessna 152 is it is such a simple aircraft with very simple systems. And so, you can read this 150 page manual and actually kind of understand all of what's going on. But if you look at something like the Vision Jet, I'm sure the POH for that is just enormous, and each of the systems are in and of themselves very complicated. And so, yeah, I could see it being quite a pain to get into. But good for you for flipping through it. There's a lot of really good information in those. So, all right. Now we're back in Palo Alto. It is should not be this nice out, but we'll leave it clear skies because that's going to be good for what we want to do. Doing a quick time check, looking all right. Okay, so let's go back to our walk around. Oops, I'm not showing the flight sim. Here we go. Wow. Piper Tomahawk, remind me, the Piper Tomahawk is that a complex airplane? Actually, I can just Google it real quick. Looks like a fun plane. 112 horsepower. Okay. Okay, cool. That seems like a good trainer plane. Very simple plane. Got it. Okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, the opposite. That seems like a really nice one. All right. Change my speed here. Otherwise, we're going to be just flying around the airplane. Okay. So the first thing we do, clubhouse is over in the back there. So we'd walk up to the plane. There wouldn't be these helpers in the field because we can do all this ourselves. Come in. Most of the equipment for prepping the plane, things like the fuel sampler, dipstick, uh, oil rags, cleaning rags, all that kind of stuff is in the back storage compartment here. So we probably come in and open that. And then we unlock the plane here, crack open the door. I don't think I can do any of this, and yeah, but that's okay. So once we've done all that, then there's a couple of things that we check inside the plane first. So I'm actually going to zoom in here and see if we can look at these things. So pulling out my checklist, which I'm sort of treating as a do list. It is saying the first thing you want to do is, you know what? How do I want to do this? I'm trying to decide if I want to do this as a checklist or as sort of a do list. I think with a real student in the plane, I would do it as a do list because I would ask them to kind of go through each of them. But especially for this first flight, I'll just sort of talk through the basics of what I'm looking for. Then I'll flip back to the Mac and run through the checklist, make sure I didn't miss anything. So, okay. So let's start a run through this. So one of the first things that I do when I check in the plane is I want to look at the Hobbs meter, and that is this number right here. Oops, a little too fast still. So this says that it's been 0.3 hours on the engine, so it's an incredibly new engine, which is nice for our sim. That would match some sort of log that the school or wherever you're renting from keeps about the plane. So in the West Valley Flying Club, it's this sort of blue book, and you'd look in there and say, okay, yes, the last person to use this, when they put away the plane, they said that the Hobbs meter was at this, and it matches. Okay, so we confirm that. Next thing we check is the tachometer, which is the time for the engine itself. So where the Hobbs meter measures the time that essentially the propeller has been spinning, the tachometer takes into account the fact that if the propeller is spinning at a low RPM, it's not putting as much wear on the propeller. So typically when you finish a flight, the Hobbs meter will show a little bit more time than the tachometer, especially if you're doing like pattern work where it's a lot of low RPM time. That's sort of be how it registers differently. But both those two things should be recorded in the flying club's record somewhere, and so you check that matches the last person that took it out. Okay, so that all looks good. Next thing I do is a bunch of the prepping the plane to actually go out. So you'll notice that there isn't any kind of control lock here, but there actually is a hole in the sim for the control lock. So what would be here is this sort of metal stick with a flag, and the flag covers up the master switch down here, these red switches. And it does it so that you can't start the plane without removing the control lock. And that control lock stops the yoke, this piece, from moving forward, back, side to side while the plane is parked away. So we'd remove that. We'd maybe take some covers off the windshields. It kind of depends on how the particular owner set it outside. Next thing we do is go in here, and I like to get a sense of what the fuel is, because if the fuel measurements are low, at our airport, you have to call a fuel truck. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time. So typically I'll turn on the battery side. I do have to turn on both in this one. Oh, that's right. So I have my yoke has the master battery switch. That's what's on. Let me try turn this on. Okay. Oh, I'm in drone mode. I always forget that drone mode doesn't let you do that. Okay, so we'll switch to this, and I'll actually just go down, and you can see sort of what I'm doing here. So I just switched the battery on. We don't really need the alternator on at this point, so there's no reason to put that extra load on. And I'm looking at the fuel, so it says that we have just under 15 gallons, so about 13 gallons on both sides, total of 26 gallons. We're going to be flying for an hour, and we burn about 10 gallons per hour. And so we expect to land with about 16 gallons of fuel. That gives us an hour and a half of extra flight time if we needed it. Um, Before every flight, you want to do good, thorough fuel checks. One of the, I think, most unfortunate reasons to have to do an emergency landing is running out of fuel, because it means that the pilot just didn't check their fuel properly or didn't do the calculations properly. So for a real flight, we would go through and talk about the fuel burn and maybe look at how much we need. For this one, the sort of rule of thumb one that I just did is okay, especially for the sim. So yeah, so we're sitting at about 13 gallons of fuel. You'll notice that the fuel read is part of the electrical system. So when I turn off the battery here, it then stops registering anything. Okay, I'm gonna put my headphones on now real quick and make sure I can hear this as well. So the next thing I'm gonna check is the avionics. And so I wanna hear an avionics fan from the front when I turn on bus one. Let's see. Yeah, okay, that's okay. This is probably a sim artifact. So, and then oops, turn that off. And when I flip on bus two, I should hear it coming from the back of the plane. And then, of course, some of the avionics will light up depending on what it is. Okay. So in a future lesson, we'll talk more about what pieces of avionics go to each of those two buses. But for now, we're just looking for that they're all sort of working as we expect. Next thing I'm going to do is turn on the lights. So I'll do a beacon, landing, taxi, nav, strobe, and also the pitot heat, which I don't think I have mapped in my controls. So when I go out, pitot heat takes a lot of load. So depending on the weather, you may or may not check this. If it's a beautiful sunny day in California, then you're not going to probably need your pitot heat, and so it's not necessarily something you need to check. But in general, I like to know what does and doesn't work on the plane, so I typically check it every time anyway. The way that you check the pitot heat is you turn it on for a second. Maybe takes maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. There's probably a specific time in the POH, and then you go to the pitot tube, which is this piece, and you can just touch it and it should feel warm. Essentially what it's doing is it's heating up the pitot tube so that if there were icing conditions, you would not accumulate ice on your pitot tube, which is how you measure your airspeed. Okay, so I'm going to turn this off again. Do I need to use, I bet I have it mapped somewhere here. Oh, I keep forgetting about the drone mode thing. Okay, great. All right, so pitot heat's off. One of the other things I wanted to show, and let's see how well this is mottoed, but the pitot heat takes a lot of energy to run. And so when I turn this on and off, I expect the amp meter to be impacted. It should show more discharge. Yeah, slightly. Okay, so when I put on the pitot heat, see how the amps go up a little bit and go back down. That's another indication that it's working correctly. All right, let's hop back out of the plane. We got our lights all on, and so we expect to be able to see all these different components. So let's see if we got, okay, there's our beacon, is this blinking red one on top. We got the white strobe and our tail fin, or I'm sorry, the tail fin light, not the strobes are a different thing. And this doesn't seem to be lighting up, which is sort of interesting. Okay. So this would be another potentially sim artifact. We can go and look and see, maybe I left a switch or something off. So just to make sure I'm not draining the battery, I typically will turn the lights all on, do one walk around now and check everything out. Okay, so our strobe's blinking. We got our right nav light is green, looks correct. Keep going around the plane. There's our taxi and landing lights. See, there's two lights there. Got our left nav light is red and good. Strobe on the left side seems like it's working. Okay, so our lights are all working except the one in the tail fin. If we were in a real aircraft and had that light missing, there'd be a bit of a longer conversation, something we'll talk about in future lessons about how we want to handle that. For the sim, we're going to just pretend like everything was working as expected and keep going with the flight. But in the real world, that go, no-go decision is a bit more of an involved conversation. So, all All right, so I'm going to turn these all off. Oops, I'm still in drone mode. Flip these all off. I typically leave the beacon on, and I would recommend that to folks here as well. Some flight instructors really, really like that. Some don't like it at all. The reason that you leave the beacon on is, let's say that you leave your master on and forget about it and walk away from your plane. With the beacon on, you can check just by turning around and seeing from a distance if the battery is still on. And the beacon draws very, very little energy anyway, so having it, it's low risk to have it on when you turn off the master. Typically, the checklists will say to turn off all electrical systems before you turn off the master. But the beacon sort of, as just a simple light, is kind of a nice one to keep on as a sanity check. So, all right, so now we're back in the plane. Gonna turn off the master. Oh, oops, you know what? I forgot something important, which is in the Cessna, the wing flaps are electrical. And so to operate them, you need the battery on. And we want to see a couple of things with these. One is we want to see that the wing flaps move at the full range that we're expecting, and they come to about the angle we're expecting. So I'm going to bring these all the way down, and when we walk around, we'll go and inspect that further. Okay, so turn the battery off. And let's flip over to the... I'm going to flip over to the Mac real quick. And we'll run through, make sure we didn't miss anything in our checklist. All right, so this is in the cabin. Oops. This is in the cabin. So pitot heat cover removed. The thing that we were checking the heat on had no cover in the game, but often that'll have a cover on it to protect it from getting debris in there, or like a bird's nest or a bug or something. The pilot's operating handbook needs to be accessible. This is a good time to talk about this. So there's a couple of pieces of documentation you need in the plane. Over here on the lesson elements, it's called AROW. Sometimes you'll see arrow with 2 R's. And it stands for Airworthiness Certificate, Registration, Radio License, which you don't need most of the time, so typically we don't look for it, but I include it here so that you know what it is. Operating limitations and weight and balance. So when you first get into the plane, especially a plane you've never flown before, you want to make sure that it has all the proper documentation before you take it out flying. So the airworthiness certificate in a Cessna is almost always stored down in this corner. So you'd see a little small sheet of paper, and it essentially says that the aircraft that you're going to fly has been certified as airworthy based on the checks that the FAA requires. The other piece of paper that'll probably be down in this corner is the registration, and this is the registration with the FAA, essentially meaning that the plane that you're about to fly has been registered in the past. They recently changed it. I can't remember the number of years. Let me make a note actually to look that up. But it's something like 3 years or so. I actually just recently purchased an aircraft, so this will be my life coming up here really soon is the new FAA rule on that. But regardless, okay, so radio license. If you are going to operate outside of the United States, then you might need a radio license. Some aircraft will already have this. Some don't. For the work that we're doing and through this entire series, we wouldn't need this. But it's good to be aware of, and also explain sometimes why you see 1 R, sometimes why you see 2 R's in the acronym. Next one is operating limitations. Operating limitations is essentially in the POH. There will be, or the simplest way to comply with operating limitations requirement is to have in the POH the limitations section, which is this section 2 here. And so this will tell you what kind of equipment you need, what the allowable speeds are, and what maneuvers are allowed, things like that. Maximum weight. Let me go to the beginning of this so you can see. Some of the operating limitations are also shown on the aircraft itself. So an interesting one is this airspeed indication markers. And so, oh, I just realized I wasn't showing where. So this is where in the airplane So I'm on the pilot side, just right. This is where that airworthiness and registration would be. Airworthiness certificate and registration, usually down in that corner. Up on the airspeed indicator, you see that there's this white arc, green arc, yellow arc. So those are another version of the limitations, just sort of encoded on the aircraft itself. But you also have it in your POH. Go back to here so we can see, okay. And then weight and balance is another important aspect here. Weight and balance is a measurement of where the weight in the how do I want to say this? Let me pull it up like this actually. So let's talk about weight and balance in general. The aircraft is designed to be flown with the weight distributed around the wings in a certain meaningful way. So for instance, if you put all the weight all the way in the very, very back of the plane and there was no weight up front, and then you tried to fly it, it would be so back heavy that you wouldn't be able to actually control it. It would just sort of, like, the wing wouldn't be effective and you wouldn't be able to fly. And so weight and balance is about looking at the distribution of weight across the length of the aircraft and making sure that you'll be able to control the airplane through all the standard maneuvers. So there'll be an entire section in the POH about weight and balance and how to calculate everything. We'll talk about this more in another lesson, but essentially there's a center of gravity for the aircraft. So if you hung the aircraft, how do I want to say this differently? The center of gravity is essentially the middle point of where all the weight is. If you just summed up all of the, kind of explaining this poorly. Well, it's the average of all of the weight distributed across the length of the plane. If you average that all out, it'll give you a point that is sort of the center of all of that weight, and that's the center of gravity. And so if you look at the diagram here, it has a note that the CG is some amount back from the front of the plane. And in order to fly, you need that CG to be within a certain range, and that means the plane will be controllable for the flight. So the way that we calculate that is we look at the weights of the individual passengers that are being loaded in. We look at the weight of the baggage and other things like that. Let me see if I can find. So like here's a sample loading of how they do it. So it'll be like the front or the rear passengers are in here, the front pilot and the front passenger, how much fuel you have. We'll look at a bunch more of this stuff in a future lesson. The important piece here is the sample loading problem has a sample airplane weight, and you can ignore the moment for now, but it has a sample airplane weight and essentially that CG, a sample sort of center of gravity for it. But in a real aircraft, depending on what instrumentation you have up front or depending on what other modifications have happened to it, like for instance in the aircraft that I'm buying, it doesn't have these wheel fairings, but it originally came with the wheel fairings. Well, when you remove those, this kind of white thing over the wheels, when you remove those, that changes the balance and the weight of the aircraft. And so a mechanic needs to go through and actually re-weigh it. So they put it on a giant scale, and they also need to rebalance it, which means figure out where that new center of gravity is. That information needs to be stored in the aircraft on a weight and balance data sheet. And typically that'll be in like the back pocket here, maybe. Oops, let me, I forgot I wasn't showing the flight scene already. Okay, great. So what I was saying is if you make a modification to the plane, like for instance, removing the wheel fairings, that's this kind of white cover, or if you add other instrumentation up front, maybe change the weight and balance. So often you'll find the weight and balance data sheet in the back here, or you might find it in like this map compartment up in front. It depends a little bit on the plane. Almost always I find it somewhere along with the POH, because typically the aircraft will have the POH in it. So that's, if you know where the POH is, which you should, then you can usually find that weight and balance in there too. Okay, quick time check. We're about halfway through, so we're doing okay. All right, so that's weight and balance. That's the documents that are required on board, so you can remember Arrow. Let's do our walk around now, and I'll kind of go through this real quick, and then we can just do a quick run on the checklist. Would an annual be where an empty weight and balance is validated, or does that happen on an ongoing basis? So it needs to be done. Great question, Shoot. So the weight and balance needs to be updated anytime there's a modification to the plane that changes the weight and balance. So it's not necessarily something that would be validated in annual, but if there was a change done at the annual for some reason, then that may require a new weight and balance to come out. But typically it would just be if there's a modification made to the plane, then that's when you would go and get it rebalanced. The most likely thing is like if you take it to an avionics shop and you get like a new GPS put in or something would be a pretty common one. That shop will have some process almost certainly that they use to get it rebalanced. Either they'll do it or they'll have a mechanic nearby that they'll work with to do it, because it's a really standard sort of part of the flow. But some things that might happen, if you get into a plane and you notice that one day when you were flying it, it had, I'm trying to think. It's sort of like in the cases where you notice something has been modified on the plane, but it doesn't have a new weight and balance. But it's a situation that you could encounter, and so that's part of the reason you do the pre-flight is you're looking for things that have changed as well in a plane you've flown before. But typically, yeah, it just happens when you do changes to the kind of key components of the plane. Shoot's trim seems to be constantly off. So if the trim was off and they just readjusted that, probably wouldn't need a new weight and balance, because almost certainly they're going to be adjusting just kind of where the trim tab point here. So this is the trim tab in the back. They're almost certainly just adjusting where that final bit lands on, or maybe they'll just be adjusting so this little triangle on here is actually for yaw trim. So this is kind of left-right trim. And so they can actually adjust this too. Like the fact that this is straight in the sim is pretty funny, because I don't think I've ever seen an airplane that doesn't have it curved a little bit. That's a manual trim adjustment they'll do. Is that sort of what you mean? So that probably wouldn't require a weight and balance change, because it's the same weight in the same location. It's just maybe like slightly tuned up a little bit. Yep, no problem. Thanks for the question. Okay, so continuing to run through my checklist here. Make sure I didn't miss anything from the inside. Check the magnetos. Okay, good. Okay, so now we're going to do the walk around. This is the diagram that you saw in the POH. So one thing to note, if you're tall like me, make sure you duck underneath this. There are these tiny diamonds on the trailing edge of the wing, and there have been many a pilot, myself included, who, without thinking, ran right forehead into it, and then you get a nice diamond-shaped injury, and then when you walk back to the flight school, everyone knows that you ran directly into the back of the plane. So happens to the best of us, but it's something to watch out for. So okay, so we're walking around here, and essentially the first thing that we're checking for is the empennage. Empennage? Yeah, I think I'm saying that right. This is let me make sure that I got the pronunciation correct before I go in. But anyway, one thing to know for me as an instructor, it's important to me that I admit when I don't know things, or if I'm unsure on things. I'd much rather you know that that's the case and then follow up and get back. So things like the pronunciation of, I think it's the empennage, but essentially this like long, the body, the sort of end of the fuselage here. So I'll tell you if I am ever not sure, or I'll give you a confidence level if there's an answer that's maybe just sort of off the cuff. I'm no I have no problem admitting when I don't know, but I'm also happy to go and look things up later. So especially if it's a question that comes up, might be something I can answer in the next series of the stream. Okay, so anyway, so essentially we're walking along here. We're looking for things like dents. We're looking to make sure that everything seems like it's connected properly. We might look under the plane in the flight sim. This is a really, really clean underbelly. Usually they're a little more dirty than this. We'll talk about the different antennas in a future lesson, but we'll look to make sure that all these antennas seem like they're in place and secure. Excuse me. We'll keep going back here. And now we're starting to look at the rudder. I'm actually going to flip out of, because I can't do this from drone mode. So I'm going to flip out to the back side so you can see sort of what I'm looking at. So what you would do is you'd grab the, can I move this sideways a little bit more? Nope. Okay, well that's fine. We'll just make it work like this. So you can grab this with your hand and sort of move it through just to see that everything moves as you're expecting. And what I'm really mostly looking for is, and in all the moving parts, what I'm looking for is security and freedom of movement. So everything should be secure, but also everything needs to be able to move in all the ways that you expect. So in this case, I would move it up good and down and move it through the full paces. So I'm doing this with my yoke. The other thing as I'm moving it that I'm looking at is, let's see if I can't get any closer. All right, I'm gonna switch back to drone mode and just show you where else I'm looking. So inside of this little gap, you can actually see some of the connections up to the front of the plane. And so if I could move it in drone mode, you'd see that when I lift it up, this all moves together and moves back, and you should see a little bit of the cable that connects it come through. So this little gap opening is one piece of it. The other places that I check, and I'll show you the rudder in just a second, is in here. You should see a little connection, and there's a rod there that you can actually see in the sim, which is nice. Oops. So I don't know if you can see that. There you go. There's the rod. So that should go all the way up, and you should see the connection there looks secure. You can see there's another window here. You can check it. And then by the time you get to the top, it's a little hard to see this one, but you should at least look to make sure everything looks like it's aligned. On the Piper Archer and on some airplanes, they'll have a, I guess limitation is the right word for it, on here that says no push. What was happening was that people were grabbing this rudder and then they would kind of push it side to side to see that everything was working, and then they would crack off the rudder. And so to avoid damaging it or to avoid bending it in any case, they said to not do that anymore. Cessna doesn't have that limitation. If you want to grab it and kind of move it a little bit back and forth to check these things, that's okay. But just be cognizant of the fact that they are a breakable part of the plane. So, I mean, not super breakable, but like a point to be aware of that is something that causes problems. So you don't want to be like throwing it side to side. You just kind of want to check that the basics are working. While you are moving it side to side, so I'll do this real quick. So if I grabbed it and move it side to side, you can actually see at the base, there's these cables that are how your feet control it. So this is the end of it. And when I move the rudder, watch, and you'll see that they both go side to side on here. So that through and that through. So if you were to grab it, you might move it like just a little bit like this. You should see that both of these two connections look secure. Again, security and freedom of movement. So that's sort of the last piece here. Other things that you want to check as you're going through underneath here. So if you lift up the rudder, let me see if I can do, if I flip to drone mode after I do that, does it keep it in place? Oh, it does. Okay, great. So often I'll look under here. On this plane, it doesn't matter as much because you're essentially looking at the rods that you can see from the top. On some planes, they'll have little connection pieces here that you might want to check to make sure that there's no like missing bolts or anything like that. And the last thing is you could look at the connection of the trim tab. So this is how trim gets adjusted when you do that. So if I go back out of this and then I play with my trim some, so you can see it just moves it a little bit. But this is me, I'm using my trim wheel on my controls now. So you can see it kind of drops down. All right, let's keep going our walk around. So yeah, okay. Oh, one other thing is in the real world, these would be tied down. So there would be some sort of chain or rope that's connecting them. So you want to make sure you take those off. It is not unheard of for people to try and taxi away and they're still connected. So doing a quick time check and continuing to think that I wish I had more time. So, all right, let me talk about how you check this wing, and then we'll kind of go through the rest of this quick. So again, you can kind of grab the trailing edge of this wing, maybe out in this section here, and you should be able to move it a little bit. This bolt here has some play, so it shouldn't be totally fixed in place. It should have a little bit of give, but it should also be, again, security but freedom of movement. I typically like to rotate this guy just kind of around itself. It's connected with this little loop at the top, and it should have a little bit of freedom in there. So if you like grab it between your fingers and kind of roll it back and forth like a pencil, it should be able to move a little bit. Okay, keep going along. I typically then will move these two up, so I'm gonna position it. And so what I'll do is I'll grab the aileron and deflect it both ways, look at the controls in the cockpit to make sure that they're working. And so now that I've put this, as I have this up, then I'll kind of scan along here and make sure that, oh, this is interesting. So the other thing I'm finding is like what doesn't exist in the sim. So there's a bunch of screws in here, and so you can check that all the screws are connected correctly, and these little cables in here, I'm sorry, the cables, the little pins in here too are all correct. So you're just kind of scanning to make sure everything looks good. All right, keep going around the front. As we get up here, then we're checking the tires, we're checking the suspension, we want to see how inflated they are. These have fairings on, so you can't quite see the actual brake assembly, but that would be good to inspect if you have access to it. Move along to the front. Typically we'll run, checking the chat. Typically you run your finger along the, actually you run your nail along the propeller here on the leading edge of it. And you're looking for nicks in the propeller. That would be a potential weak point if there are any nicks. And the kind of rule of thumb is if your thumbnail catches on a nick, that's deep enough that you should be concerned. If you can run over it, like a little bit of texture isn't a problem. It's really if your thumbnail's catching on anything. A lot of flight instructors will tell you to give a wide berth around the propeller. Well, we'll talk more about propeller safety when we talk about shutdown. But in general, you do want to be really cautious about this. There's a lot of things we do to make sure that the propeller won't accidentally kick, but it doesn't take, or it only takes one time for it to be a really bad incident. So typically you'd walk around the side like this, and then inside of this, you can actually reach in to here, and you see that little belt, that's the alternator belt. And so you can actually reach your hand through this hole and just kind of push on the alternator belt, make sure it's tight, make sure it's connected, so that you at least have reason to believe that the alternator is working. You can grab the exhaust and kind of pull on it a little bit, make sure that the exhaust system isn't loose. And again, we're checking tire pressure, we're checking brakes if we could. We might roll the airplane forward and backwards to make sure that there's no bald spots in the tires. We already checked the lights up here. How do they model it? Maybe they don't. Here we go. Okay. So this is the stall horn, and essentially what it does is, in the real plane, it would be sort of a small hole there, so it wouldn't just be a white cover on a white square. And the stall horn in this plane works by the vacuum created from the airflow separation of the wing causes the stall horn to go off. So to test it, what you can do is you can get either a tester, which is what I use, and it basically creates a small vacuum. You can hear the stall horn go. You could also like inhale on it if you wanted to create a vacuum with your mouth, but you might get some bugs and stuff, so I don't really recommend that. In practice for this type of plane, you should be checking that it's clear and making sure that there's no reason to believe it's going to be problematic. I'm trying to think about the best advice to give on this is. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. The Piper Archer has an electric one, so you flip on the master and you move the tab, and then that one you can hear pretty easily. You also want to check the pitot tube, make sure that there's nothing, no debris. Sometimes if someone takes it out flying, get a bug down that hole, and that would mean your airspeed indicator doesn't work. So we're also checking the static ports here. So this is, we'll talk more about the static systems later, but making sure that there's a little tiny hole on here that's not modeled. and that should be clear. Okay, we already checked the lights. We're doing the same thing we did on the other side on these wings. Um, and then we're back at the beginning. Okay, and then I'm going to run through my checklist to make sure that I didn't miss anything else. We watched that video about how to check fuel quantity, fuel quality, and those things. One of the other liquids that we need to check is the oil. So this is where the oil dipstick is. They have it modeled as a screw, which is not unheard of, but is pretty uncommon now. Instead, you typically just twist it open, take the dipstick, just like checking oil in your car, and you make sure it has enough oil quantity in there. Removed earlier in the pre-check. So typically, shoots, I think it's a little bit up to you how you prefer to do it. My flow is that I take down all of the um, coverings of the plane at the very beginning just to kind of get the plane set up to be inspected. So like I come in, I remove the control lock, I'll remove the pitot cover, I'll remove any windshield glare things. So I would typically do it first just to have it done. You totally could, if you wanted to customize your flow a little bit differently, you could say that when I check the pitot tube, I'll take the pitot tube cover off. Yeah, I think it's a little bit up to you. I think I would recommend probably taking it off first because taking off with your pitot cover is so problematic that it's like, for me, it's one of those things that I want to get. Like, I'd rather have the pitot cover off from the beginning, and then when I do the walk around, I've now reconfirmed that I have the pitot cover off instead of having it be when I first look at it is also the first time I'm taking it off. Does that make sense? Like, I'd rather have two checks almost. Things like sandflies that go. Yeah, totally. If there are other reasons not to take it off, I would say the same applies to the control lock too. Like if you're in a really windy area, or if there's reasons that having the ailerons be able to move and things like that so early, that you might need to leave some of those things on. But totally agree. This is a really good point. Like sandflies. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's, sandflies is a good example. There's not a lot of conditions I can think of where it would be so problematic that you wouldn't want to take the pitot tube cover off, but you still would want to go flying. Like if it was like really bad snow or something that could clog up the pitot tube, but then you have the pitot heat, I guess, is a bad example. Thinking like if there's really heavy blowing sand, but then you wouldn't go flying anyway. Anyway, yeah, but that's a good point. Okay, and check the lights already. Okay, so yeah, so we would have checked the fuel. The strainers on here are not modeled, or the fuel sump, excuse me. So there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I think that's the rough locations of these. And then on the aircraft itself, let's see if any of these are modeled. Okay, so none of them are modeled here, but there'd be 1, 2, 3 more on the underbelly, and then 5 more over here. So you check each of those ones when you go and strain it out. All right. Um, Flight deck organization. So typically you want to put things in this pocket is a good idea to use it. You don't really want things floating loose around your feet. And you may put maps and other things that are really light in here, but you kind of have to imagine, like if you've ever been on a big commercial flight and there's some turbulence, if you have that kind of bumpiness, you don't want things just flying around the cabin. So you kind of want to have an organized flight deck. All right, let's get started here then. So now we're on from, let me make sure I didn't miss anything else important on our pre-flight inspection. We would have taken all the tie downs down. There's a passenger briefing element, talk about how the seatbelts work and a couple of other safety aspects depending on your passenger. So I would explain how the seatbelts work. We'll talk about specifically the laws on that, but there are some FAA regulations on what you must include in your passenger briefing. Also part of the reason when you go on a big commercial flight, there's that long, like here's how to use the emergency equipment, here's how to use the seatbelts. Even though if you've been on a couple of those, it feels like it's all really repetitive or kind of self-explanatory. One, you never know who's the first time on the flight, so it's good to get everyone on board. But also there's FAA requirement that you do that every time. Okay, so now we're on the before starting engine checklist. So I can flash this up momentarily so you can see what I'm looking at on my iPad. So pre-flight inspection is complete, passenger briefing is complete, seatbelts and seats and seatbelts are adjusted and locked. The view that I'm looking for on here is, oops, back here, come on, being so problematic. Oh, there we go, okay. Okay, so let me show you. Great question, Shoots. The fire extinguisher is only required if the POH says that it's required, which is sort of a cop-out answer. Um, the 172 has a location on it. Actually, something interesting about this particular modeling is the seats are super close, which makes me wonder if it's not actually a 172 they're trying, or I'm sorry, a 172 SP they're trying to model, or if it's some other aircraft. It says SP on here though, so. But typically you'd find the fire extinguisher between these two seats, and yeah, you'd want to check if the fire extinguisher is in the green arc. We have to look in the POH to see if that's required for flying or not. If it's in there, you definitely want to check that the fire extinguisher looks like it's functioning correctly. Otherwise, I mean, you don't want to have in a situation where you think you have a functioning fire extinguisher when you need one. So, but yeah, good question. So the sort of cop out, but also true answer is like only if it's required by the POH. All right, so I'm resetting my trim here for takeoff. I probably should just do that as part of the checklist instead. I just forgot that I had adjusted it a bunch. All right, check the circuit breakers. Typically, you run your finger over them, kind of feel, make sure that none of them are sticking out. They all look good. Electrical equipment is all off except the beacon, which is the exception. And fuel selector valve needs to be on both. It's on both. Typically, it would be stored either left or right. And this is so that when you refuel the plane, because the two tanks are connected, if you refuel on the right, but it's on a slight incline, it might roll over to the left. And then when you refuel the left, it may be that the right is actually drained some. So you typically store it either left or right. But we put it to both to fly. And then the fuel shutoff valve is in, just to show you if it was, oh, it was off. Okay, so the fuel shutoff valve was off. I wish they didn't have, most of them don't carry this in it. Well, some do. But you have the fuel shutoff valve on, pushed all the way in. Otherwise, fuel won't be going to the engine. Okay, so that's good. All right, so now we get to the actual starting the plane. So for seat height, it's a little bit pilot's choice. Typically, I would recommend being, see if I can get this to kind of where I would want it. I think you can hold maybe, is it shift? No, control? Nope. I would like to be about halfway between the view that I have here and the view that I have here. So I typically go up because I want to see the front of the cowling. So this would be my normal, I'm flying in the flight sim view. In the actual plane, I would adjust my seat a little lower because I just want to see the top of the cowling a little bit. I'm trying to maximize my visibility. A little bit of personal preference on that one, but that's sort of my recommendation. And then your feet should be so that you can reach the pedals and use the brakes fully. But it also, you need to have freedom to move the yoke because you would have your knees right here. And if you hit your knees, it's a problem. So that's the other thing you'd be checking for. There's a view for sim. Mouse wheel allows fine adjustment of view for sim. Oh, really? Uh-huh. All right. Do you have to hold down something to wheel it? I was using the arrow keys, so you probably picked up. Okay. So now we're going to start the airplane. So the first thing we're doing is we'll bring the throttle about a 1/4 inch open, just enough to let a little bit of fuel flow through. And essentially this would be all the way out. Essentially what we're doing is we're priming the engine, so we're going to get a little bit of fuel in the engine so it'll actually fire and start. Let me switch over to my... One thing I highly recommend is customizing your own checklist. So I was using the POH checklist, and it's in a different order than I typically do things in. And the reason I have a customized checklist is because the flow makes more sense, like how you move through the cockpit. So, okay. One tip for you, anyone going out flying, is you can save some money on the Hobbs meter by calling ATIS. So, for instance, Palo Alto has a phone number you can dial and get the ATIS without needing to start the engine. That just means you're not burning money listening to the radio, especially while you're new, because you might need to listen to the ATIS a couple of times to understand all the different elements of it. Okay, mixture idle cutoff. So this mixture is all the way back. Master switch off. External, oh, this is external power. This is what I want. All right. Master switch on, so we'll turn on both the alternator and the battery. And then flashing beacon is on, so that's one way to notify people that you are about to start the engine. It's just the beacon will come on when you do that. Auxiliary fuel pump on, that's the switch, so we'll flip that. Bring the mixture to full rich, so we push that all the way in. And then the, oops, sorry, I was checking things when I should have been zoomed in already. So essentially what we're looking for, let me pull back the mixture. So we're gonna turn the fuel pump on, and that's gonna get a little bit of fuel flow going, and we want about 4 seconds or so of fuel flow on the, once we bring in the mixture, and then we'll pull the mixture back. So I'll turn the fuel pump on. I bring the mixture, so this red knob I'm gonna bring all the way in. So that comes all the way in. And then as I do that, we should see a little bit of fuel flow here. I think one thing, it might be not modeled in the sim, but we'll see. Okay, there we go. So that's about what we're expecting. 2, 3, 4, bring the mixture to idle. So now my mixture is all the way cut off again. And then I turn off the fuel pump. Okay, so now it's primed. Next thing you do is call clear to make sure that there's no one else around the aircraft. So I typically open up the window and yell out something like, either you'll prop clear a lot. I like to just say clear, so go clear. Hopefully that wasn't too loud. I'm trying to turn my head away. And listen for anyone to respond, or also we're looking around the aircraft, so we want to make sure that we don't see anyone outside the windows. Okay, looks pretty good. And then if no one responds, then we're gonna bring the propeller to start, and then as soon as it catches, we're gonna bring the mixture to full rich. So start, and then it caught, and so we bring the mixture full in. Okay, so all right, looks good. We want to adjust the throttle to about 1,000 RPM. Everything looks good. I'm holding the toe brakes. You can't see. I could also turn the parking brake on. All right, I don't think you can hear anything really. It's kind of interesting. My volume is just down too low. There's a couple of things that are tricky about using the sim to practice flying. Two of the big ones that I don't really like is the sounds aren't quite right, and the feel of the airplane, like the actual responsiveness, is, as you might expect, pretty off. And that sort of feel of the aircraft is a really important thing to be developing as a student. So one of the reasons I mentioned that I couldn't hear things is because I was expecting to hear certain sounds when it catches, and certain sounds when it's starting to spin, and certain sounds at the certain RPMs. And I wasn't really hearing those. Partially I have my volume turned down, I think a little bit too much. But also just the sim doesn't model it quite right. So something to consider when you're practicing these. Okay, one thing I should have called out right away is as soon as the engine catches, then we look over at the oil pressure. It's a little low in the sim. If I brought up the throttle a little bit, it'll probably come up. Yeah, okay, so I'm bringing the throttle just to show you that it's increasing. That's an artifact of the sim. It might be a little low, like on the low side of the green arc when you start it, but it really should be in the green arc. The oil pressure is what makes sure that the engine is getting enough oil. And if it's really low, or if it stays totally flat, then there's an emergency procedure we would do to essentially shut down the aircraft, because the engine's probably going to seize. Okay, that's probably too much information for someone's first flight, now that I'm thinking about it. This is a lot of just like start the airplane up. Okay, we turn on the nav lights, turn on Oh, I guess we don't really need nav lights for this. We do want uh, strobe. We can leave our taxi and landing lights off. Actually, let me make sure. Um, there is. I'm just quickly looking to see. Yeah, what you need for aircraft lights during the day, because I want to make sure that I don't mislead you. You need your anti-collision lights at any time. And we'll talk about that more. Oops. Oh no, what happened? Oh, I don't know why the lights are going on and off in the plane. Um, yeah, okay. So, yeah, you don't need your nav lights during the day. I had heard some discussion at a recent club event I was going to about kind of when you go in details through the regulations that the set of lights are both more clear and less clear. So um, we'll do these ones for now. I made a note to go and check to see what the summary of that discussion was to make sure I don't miss anything. But for now, I'll just do the beacon and strobe, and then when we get going, we can take taxi light. When you're in a busy area like the Bay Area, you're supposed to voluntarily turn your main lights on just to make yourself more visible in the sky. So I typically fly with my taxi light. Um, yeah. Okay, so checking through, make sure to miss anything else. So we do radios on, so flip these two switches. I'll just do it on my controls. And that should start up our avionics. I don't know what's going on. This is really odd. It's like coming in and out. See that flickering? Mm, weird. Okay, well, I'm gonna guess this is a sim artifact. Yeah, see, because it comes on when I turn through certain angles. Um, and let me do this. I'm gonna shut down the aircraft and just real quick, and then bring these all back up and use the Control E system to just restart the engine. So we don't have to go through the whole thing again. Let's see. That's so interesting. Uh, okay, let me restart this real quick. So we won't do the full setup again. I will just use Control E and get the plane going. Okay. We talked a little bit about the. Great. Okay, everything's working here. Control E. Okay, good. So I don't know why that was, but okay. So let me pull up the syllabus real quick for taxiing. So airport and taxiway familiarization. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. But if I go over to the Palo Alto map, we need to get over to the runway. With the winds as they are typically here, we'll usually be at 3-1. So they'll probably have us leave on Romeo, this R, up to Yankee, and then Alpha. Um, for today's flight, I'll handle all the radios and then we can taxi, but you can do the taxiing for it. So the way that you taxi, this is me talking to a student, um, is using the rudders down here. So So if I look down low here, you can see that I'm moving these. So that is how you steer the plane. The yoke doesn't do anything. So as we're taxiing along, you'll use your feet to control it. And I'll typically, for a first lesson like this, would ask the student to put their hands in their lap, just so they're not tempted to use the yoke at all. In future lessons, we also would do a little bit of work on wind correction angle. Today, I'll do the yoke, so you don't have to think about it. But what wind correction angle all about is that you want to position the yoke relative to the wind, essentially so that the aircraft doesn't get lifted up by the wind unexpectedly or pushed in a way that you aren't expecting it to. So, for instance, if you had a wind coming from the quartering headwind up to the front, then you push the yoke into it, um, sort of deflect. And then as you taxi around, of course, the direction of the wind relative to the plane changes, so you move the yoke around a little bit. We'll talk about that more later. So for today, I'll handle the uh, uh, aileron deflection for wind correction. The only thing to mention is while we're taxiing, we'll use the throttle for our power to move the plane forward. You don't want to have any power applied whenever you're using the brakes. So the first thing to do if you want to slow down always is bring the power back. Okay, so without further ado, the first thing we do is call up the ground at Palo Alto. They control the ground movement, and tell them what we want to do. Every radio communication has the same format. We'll practice this quite a bit in the coming days, so for now I'll just handle it. But essentially I'm going to tell them who we are, where we are, and what we want. And then they're going to respond with, probably they're going to say something like, you are, taxi to runway 31 via Romeo Yankee, Yankee 1 Zulu, so that's the Zulu. And then they'll say something like advise run up complete. So that's a Palo Alto thing. And so what that means is that before we actually taxi all the way to 3-1, they want us to advise them that we've done our run up. So, all right. Anything else that I'm going to say on here? Oh, that's sort of interesting. Okay. Well, one second. Let me see what's going on. Hi. All right. Okay, so taxi over there. So call up the tower, give us the taxi instructions, and then take off here. One habit to develop early is to check your brakes. So one is you can just check that they work here, but then also as soon as we bring, oops, I don't want the throttle up that high. As soon as we bring the parking brake off, we start to move. So we bring up the throttle just a little bit, get a little bit of motion. Okay, and then we're checking our brakes to make sure that they work. I don't know why I'm turning to the right. It's like it's registering that the right. So there is a little bit of right turning that can happen for reasons we can talk about, but it shouldn't at this lowest speed. So just so uh, this is pretty weird. I'm also turning to the right. Very strong wind. Maybe, let's see. I think I have it on clear skies. I wasn't expecting any wind. Oh, I should have grabbed the ATIS. That's so funny. Oh, I did have live weather. You're right. I bet that's exactly what it is. Haha. Also, I didn't talk about the ATIS, which is no good. So before you would call up, yeah, it is. It's just super strong winds from the weather today, but I only have, it's not rendering the clouds, it's just rendering the wind. Okay, well, I'm gonna turn off live weather because we don't need to deal with that today, but I think that's exactly what's going on. Good intuition shoots. Um, so that would be exactly where the wind correction comes in. One of the things I forgot to talk about, which you would have to do before you call up the tower, is the ATIS information. So this is the, oops, I wasn't on the flight sim either. ATIS information, which is the um, essentially the current weather for that airport. You would call them up on the radio, or you would listen to it on the radio, and it would tell you things, essentially the same things you see here, the METAR. So if we go here and go back to live weather, the METAR for Palo Alto is saying, so this is the timestamp. It gives you the wind, so that's the direction and speed. Gusting to 27 knots is pretty strong. Visibility, light rain, a broken layer at 3,000, which is also why I was saying that it doesn't seem like it matches, because there's no layer of clouds. Overcast to 4,000. Temperature, dew point, and then altimeter setting. So altimeter setting would be set in here when we hear that. And sure enough, we're at about sea level, so that's about what we expect. I want to make sure that's where it's supposed to be. Okay, good. But I'm actually going to put it onto clear skies, and so as soon as I do that, then it becomes whatever pressure I set, 29.92, excuse me, which is standard pressure. You got the dialed in, great. And then we have no wind set here, so, or 1 knot of wind, which is nice, so we want to deal with it for this. Okay, so, sorry, let's keep taxiing. So I am going, that's my Romeo thing. Okay. So you want to be taxiing about, oops, let me get back to, okay, before I start going wild. So you want to be taxiing about walking speed. And you want to taxi so that your center of the aircraft is on the yellow taxi line here. So in the real plane, it should feel like your foot is on the yellow line. That's about correct. You can always move your head to the center and kind of check your alignment. But the rough feel is it should feel like your left or your right foot is on the line. And I'm always looking for other airplanes in the airport. One of the reasons that the height of the seat matters, so you can see under the wings. And then keeping myself aligned with this line as we come through. If you need to, you can use a little bit of toe braking to get through a turn. With the Cessna, you really shouldn't have to, but with some planes, you really do. So you see me doing a little bit of that. It's 12:43. I think what I'm going to do is finish the rest of the lesson plan pieces, because there's not a ton left. This is sort of a modeling difference, but now we're coming over to the run-up area to do that. So I'm going to finish through the rest of the lesson plan, and then plan to go just for a kind of a joyride at the end. So I'll go a little long. I'll make sure to finish the content in the 2 hours. Oh, wait a minute. Okay. So this, oh, I see what they've done. Okay, that's fine. In the real airport, it looks a little different, so I got sort of confused here. These T-bars are where we want to be for run-up. So I'm going to go in here. I'll take the first one here, shoots if you want to pop in the second one. And you'll notice that they're kind of angled a little bit away from each other. If you do ever fly out of Palo Alto, depending on where you're from, there's also a fence right next to these. So you definitely want to be watching your wings. One, so that you don't hit other aircraft, but also so you don't hit the fence. And what I'm trying to do is then line up on this guy. Let's see if we can pull in. Good news is that controlling the airplane in the real world is a little easier in most of these things, actually, especially in the landing, I find, because the weight of the aircraft you can feel a lot more. If you ever do practice IFR, okay, so my alignment's not great. It would be nice to be a little better, but we should be right on that T-bar. Okay, bring it up to 1,000. I'm gonna throw the parking brake on. Do a quick run up. Run up is essentially a way of checking all of the systems we're going to use when we fly before we actually go flying. So let me put it on the Mac real quick. And there's an acronym that folks will use a lot, cigar tip. Controls, instruments, gas, altimeter, run up, trim, interior, and propeller. When you're first starting out, again, you want to pull out the checklist that you have. One that I really like actually is, let me see if I have it up here, the checkmate checklist. So like on here, it has the run-up procedure you can see is in this column. And so this will run you through these things. You'll see that there's a lot of overlap with cigar tips. Cigar tips is sort of used as a confirmation that you've done everything. Think of it as like a flow that you might then check with the checklist as opposed to the extent of what you need to do. So, okay, so let's go through this. I'm going to pull up my own customized checklist, the one that I like, which is in here. So I have my before takeoff checklist, and then I'll go back to the plane. Parking brake is set. Seat backs are in the upright position. Seat belts are on. Cabin doors are locked and secure. You might want to reach your arms out and kind of push on the doors just to make sure they're clear. Flight controls are free and correct. So you want to box your controls, they'll say, which is move it through the entire range of motion and make sure you don't hit anything. Like, for instance, I just hit both my iPad and my throttle quadrant. That's pretty funny. But you want to make sure you don't hit anything in the plane, especially knees. The other thing is that you want to be looking out the window and make sure that it moves the correct direction. So when I rotate to the left like this, I expect the one, my right hand is now kind of on top, and my thumb is pointing out the window. I should expect to see that aileron go up. And so sure enough, it goes up. I look out the other way, and I should see the other aileron go up, which if it was a little lower, you could see. There you go. So now that aileron goes up. That's good. And then we can look behind at the rudder. And when I pull the rudder, so that's me pulling back and pushing down. Okay, good. So you can kind of see that all the flight controls are working correctly. Again, much easier in the real plane when you can kind of move around. Or if you're in VR, it works pretty well too. You can do all that. Fuel quantity, check. Okay, so we're doing well. Mixture rich. Oh, I should have had the mixture back for taxi. How did that get missed? I'm going to add something to my checklist. Which is essentially to say that I want the mixture leaned for taxi. This is in the POH as well of how to do this. And so for today, we'll just sort of say that that was leaned, but that's a good thing to be doing. Okay. Flight controls, flight instruments, check and set. So flight instruments all look good. Nothing looks out of the ordinary. My throttle is pretty far advanced. I only want 1,000 RPM. And something you'd hear in the plane. Okay, checking all these off. Mixture rich before we do the what do they call this in cigar tobacco acronym? Oh, just the run up. Before we do the run up, so we're gonna essentially operate the plane at a higher speed and make sure that all of our systems work as we expect. So mixture's rich. I'm rechecking the fuel selector, so we're on both. Good. Bring the throttle up to 1,800 RPM. Okay, so let's get to 1,800. Good. Okay, and then I go check my right magneto, and I see a drop of 120. That's okay. And my left magneto, see a drop of 120. So they have the same drop, which is good. That's sort of what we expect for a simulated plane. There's a certain tolerance of what those can be. I also am checking the vacuum gauge over here. We expect this to be in the green arc. That is just barely, but it is in the green arc. Engine instruments and ammeter. So the alternator seems to be working. We're charging. I don't think I've ever seen it charge at that rate, so I don't know why it's so high on here. Usually it's just like barely off zero. And then the last thing I'll do is check the idle. So I'm going to bring the propeller all the way back, the throttle, all the way back to idle just to make sure the plane idles. correctly. Okay, good. 650 is fine for idling. Okay, bring that back up and back to 1,000. A couple other things that we could check if we wanted to, and we would do if we were in the plane, would be like the throttle friction. So there's a little control thing, this little ring around the throttle. This controls the friction. That's how hard it is to push in or change the throttle location. There's also things about how you hold the throttles in this plane that are useful to know. Let me actually make a note to find a video. Because this is one of those things that would be really hard to explain without seeing, but really easy when you see it. So I'll make a note for that. Got 9 minutes left on here. All right, probably get just a takeoff. Throw a heading indicator. Okay, so I'm setting the heading indicator to the runway heading, which in this case is 3-1. So that's just as a reference. So when I'm taking off, to make sure that I'm pointing the direction I expect to be pointing, and not taking off from the wrong runway, which is a potential risk. What else? Nav GPS. So I'm going to have it on GPS mode. And we should check the autopilot because we have one in the plane. Anytime you have an autopilot, you want to make sure that you can overpower it in case it goes, in case anything happens with it. You want to make sure that you're stronger than the autopilot motor. I'm not going to do that check here because it doesn't make sense in the sim really, but that is a good thing to do. Elevator trim set for takeoff. So in this case, I'm looking at the trim here. That little triangle tells us where takeoff is, so that's good. I also believe, although I'm not sure, but I believe that the white line on the game here is also meant to be the trim for takeoff setting. So if anyone knows or can confirm that, I'd be interested to hear. But that seems to be at least my experience with it. Takeoff briefing. So we have a plan of what we're going to do in case we need to do any kind of if there's an emergency during takeoff. So if we don't develop the engine power or airspeed isn't working, we'll bring the power back to idle, apply full brakes, and then just taxi off the runway and see what's going on. If we have already taken off or there's not enough runway to do that stop, then we'll lift off and plan to land forward. In any of those cases, for the whole flight today, so I'll be pilot in command, so I'll be flying the airplane and getting us up to altitude, and then you can do some flying around there. If we have already got up to pattern altitude, then we can turn around and attempt to land back on the airport at some sort of reasonable surface. When we talk about emergencies more, we'll talk about specifically what all these look like. All right. And then last but not least, we set our wing flaps to 10 degrees. The POH says you can go 0 or 10 degrees if you'd like. My instructor had some good advice, which is to teach 10 degrees because it also then means that there's a cleanup element. So after we take off, then the plane has to be cleaned up. I'm going to lean the mixture for taxi since we're sitting here. So I recommend taking off with 10 degrees flaps. It works just as fine. But you technically don't need to if you don't want to. So, all right. Then we would call up Palo Alto Tower and say something like, Palo Alto Ground, say something like Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra 3, or run up complete. And then they would say taxi to Yankee 1, or taxi and hold short Yankee 1, and then call tower. So if I go back to the Mac, you can see we're now in the run-up area. They'd tell us to kind of hold short at Yankee 1 there before we turn on, call up tower, and then tower would eventually clear us for takeoff. For the last couple minutes here, just to close out the lesson, I'm going to talk about post-flight procedures, and then we'll actually go flying. So post-flight, I got to figure out how exactly I want to teach this one, but there's a tie-down technique, which is that you kind of attach change to the wings in the back of the plane. This is just to keep the plane from bouncing around if it gets really windy or from getting blown into other planes on the airport. Each of the T-bars you see in the distance here would have, sorry, these guys off here would have chains, at least at Palo Alto, that you can tie the plane up to. It depends where you are on if it's ropes or chains or a cable or something, but there's usually some way to tie it down, or you should have stakes of your own. Securing the aircraft, so we put the control lock back in, put the pitot cover back on, any of the windshield glare sort of things. Make sure that the plane's not going to be rattling around if winds do come up. And the last thing that we do is document flight time and then squawk any observations. So at the end of Microsoft Flight Sim, they put up this sort of like example logbook entry from whatever the flight was that you just did. So that kind of gives you a sense of what that looks like. But essentially it's the how many hours did you fly based on the Hobbs meter. That's this guy in the corner. So that's how much time were you actually flying. So we started at 0.3, we're at 0.5 now. If we, maybe you come back and this says 0.9, then that would be 0.6 hours of flying. And then we'll write in what we did today. So for today's lesson, we would write in, we did pre-flight taxi procedure, before takeoff check, and post-flight procedures would essentially be the logbook entry. And then we might talk about, did a demo flight for the flying bit. If there's anything that occurs in the aircraft or something of note that another pilot might want to know, we'll write that in the at West Valley. It's kind of a blue book, but every club will have some sort of way of communicating, hey, there's something that happened with the plane or something that other pilots might want to know about. In the simulated aircraft, we don't have those sorts of problems, but in the real world, things come up from time to time, and so you just need to note them. One that you might encounter would be like a bald spot on a tire. You might want to write that down just so that it's clear to the next person, like, well, that's maybe because that would be one you'd probably want to take a picture of and document beforehand so that it's clear that it wasn't your bald tire that happened, but something else occurs that you just want people to know about. Maybe the engine runs rough at a certain speed or something else that's just sort of odd. Okay. And the last thing to mention, some common errors. Let me flip back to the Mac. A couple common errors to be aware of. Forgetting checklist items. Too much use of braking. So if you are on the brakes while you're taxiing, that's a problem. While taxiing, not reducing the power before braking. Taxiing too fast or carrying too much power while taxiing can be a big problem. So you want to, again, go about a walking speed. And then incorrect position of controls relative to the wind. Otherwise, you might get blown around in some weird ways, like me earlier when I didn't realize that we had live weather on. One thing I forgot to mention then, but at the airport, you can see this windsock off on the side. So let me flip back to here. So there's this sort of orange and white windsock. They'll tell you the wind direction. So right now we have a very, very light wind, so it doesn't really matter. I would call it a calm wind day, meaning that we probably would take off on runway 31. When it was super windy, like before, it's on live weather again, you can see then the windsock shows the direction and that it's pretty speedy. That's another way of knowing which way you want to position your flight controls, because that would give you an indication of your attitude relative to the wind, so the way you're facing relative to the wind. Okay. Close out here with completion standards, recommended homework. So for this lesson, the client must be proficient at pre-flight inspection, engine start, safe taxiing techniques, before takeoff check, and post-flight procedures. Good news is we're going to do this every single flight, and so you'll get pretty good at it by the end. The required homework for today is none, and the recommended homework for today is also none. So pretty easy first lesson. I will include actual recommended homework and required homework for an actual student. So if you're listening in and eager to do some education on the side, those are really good practice things. This lesson plan has been geared toward real world flying. So, there's a couple of things in there where it's like chair flying the procedures by flying in them. Well, anyway, we'll talk about it when we get to specific homeworks, but Yeah, basically for today, there's no specific homework. In future days, there is potential homework. If you want to do it, that's great. Otherwise, I won't assume anyone has done any of it for this series, but it might be nice if you want the extra education. All right, well, that's 1 o'clock. So thank you all very much. We'll call that the end of the lesson. I'm going to go for a fun flight because it's already been kind of a lot of prep work and lead up to just not to go flying. So if you want to stick around and just kind of enjoy the scenery, I can do it sort of as my normal bay tour, which is sort of fun. Talk a little bit about what an actual demo flight would be like, but then mostly just go sightseeing. So, all right. Okay. Pause for transition. Okay, great. So let me make sure that all my audio still seems okay. All right. And I got the whole aircraft set up. Good. Okay. So first thing we're going to do, we just finished doing our run-up. One of the things that makes a bay tour a little complicated is there's a lot of radio work. And so part of the reason that I wouldn't do this as a real demo flight is that, like, when I take people flying on a bay tour who are in town. Oh, I should talk about this actually. So a bay tour doesn't have a specific definition. I actually wrote a blog post about how I fly the bay tour. So if that's useful, probably easiest to message in the Discord, but I can also, if anyone wants to see that, I can grab the link real quick and just post it in the chat. But essentially what the bay tour means is it's flying sort of around the Bay Area here, starting from wherever you are in some direction, typically over and around the Golden Gate Bridge. So if I go like this, you can actually see, and can I draw on here? So maybe be like, leave from Palo Alto, fly over along. If you get cleared to go through SFO, then maybe you'll go through SFO out along the shore over the Golden Gate. Maybe you'll circle Alcatraz. Maybe you'll circle Angel Island. If you want to, you can go over Berkeley, past UC Berkeley, down. Typically, they have you go across Oakland Airport to get back. And then they'll have you go to the San Mateo Bridge. And then if you're going back here, or if you're going to San Carlos, this would be kind of more or less what my typical bay tour looks like. And I can talk about specific waypoints and things. A lot of it is to deal with the airspace and permissions you need. So you notice how, actually I wouldn't do it probably like this. I'd probably start off by going out further because I don't want to deal with San Carlos airspace right away. Although if you're coming from Palo Alto, often they'd rather you get handed off to San Carlos. Anyway, this is all getting kind of in the weeds. I guess I've moved on from the standard first lesson. I'm kind of talking about the details. But a lot of this pattern is because it allows you to avoid SFO's airspace, except in places where you're explicitly crossing it. But you'll see people do, let me clear this real quick. You'll see people do all sorts of routes for a bay tour. So another common one that I really like to do is you can leave from Palo Alto, cross over Sonol here, and then go up past Mount Diablo through this little valley area. Mount Diablo is really, really pretty. It's the tallest mountain in the Bay Area. And then this little corridor is actually not, let me do it this way actually. Yeah, so you can kind of see. So this corridor is really level. So it works really nicely for just kind of sightseeing. You can see the Berkeley Hills from the backside. And then you can fly over. There's a nice view of Napa Valley down this way. If you're going to Napa Valley, you can just land, which is nice. And then I usually come back, not usually that far on the bay. Usually I try to stay a little closer to shore. And then again, maybe circle Angel Island, cross the Golden Gate Bridge. On a long bay tour, I might continue along the coast to Half Moon Bay. Just a disclaimer, this is a very rough path because there's a bunch of considerations about specifically where I fly. Like I would never go this far out and anyway, so there's a longer discussion. Don't just fly this as it is, but just as a rough idea. You might go fly over Half Moon Bay, which is really pretty. If you wanted to, you could keep going down the coast, or you could cut back in. There's a view of the reservoirs right here that's really nice, right down along this corridor. And actually where most of the flight training from San Carlos takes place is kind of along this corridor, so it's really pretty. Also the San Andreas default is right here if you're like that kind of thing. So, okay. But anyway, so another version of the bay tour is just an out and back. So you kind of cross like this and go back around. Because we're just kind of having fun and flying around today, I'll try and do the bay tour that goes around over Oakland because I can talk about some of the elements to it. And we'll come back to Palo Alto kind of like that. So, okay, let me put on my, oops, not that one, airspace here. And I'm actually going to build out this flight plan real quick. Maybe I have it saved. Yeah, there we go. It should be in here. It says it wasn't there. Okay, so this is the actual flight plan that I typically used. To go through the class Bravo, you have to be approved in the class Bravo, so that's a communication point that comes up. But often you can get that. One of the other things that's sort of interesting to keep in mind is the professionalism that you use on the radio is something that the controllers will notice and also become something that I don't know if they're technically allowed to, but they seem to use that as a determination of how much latitude they'll give you. So if you're obviously competent on the radio, you seem to know what you're doing, and haven't been a problem for them, haven't been doing anything erratic, sometimes they'll let you just fly right over SFO, or they'll let you fly in certain corridors. If you're being a problem for them, they will give you a direction that is basically, head due west for however long until you leave the Bravo, and then they won't clear you back in. So just something to keep in mind is being diligent, being professional helps a lot with that. This is flight plan starting from San Carlos, which is not normally where I start from, but we'll just replace that with Palo Alto, and maybe we'll land at San Carlos on the way home. That should be kind of fun. Okay, so I won't worry about the radio communications today. I'll talk a little bit about some things if they're interesting as we're flying, but mostly we'll just go have a nice flight around. Make sure I'm doing my checklist all right. Okay, so they probably say you are approved for takeoff. So one thing that's kind of obnoxious about the sim, in the real world, my head would be on a swivel here. So I'll try and simulate that a little bit. Knowing that I can't hit other aircraft does make this less stressful, but is one of my frustrations with simulated flying. And I want to keep the yellow line lined up, taxiing through. I would stop then at the Yankee 1, this hold bar up here, and talk to the tower, and then they'd probably say something like line up, they'd probably say something like hold short 3-1, and that would mean that I can cross this bar. So I'll just keep going. Here, again, in the real world, we would stop and get approval for all these things. Okay, this is the hold bar before we enter the runway, so the double on this side. And so before we cross that, we need approval. Let's say something like clear for takeoff 3-1. Before we cross it, we'll go lights, camera, action. So lights is about the lights that we have on here. So I'm going to turn on everything except my landing light just to maximize visibility of flying around the busy bay airspace. So that's my lights. My camera is my ADS-B, which is required and is not currently on. So this would be set to VFR probably. If we're doing a real bay tour, they'll probably go to some squawk code. So maybe like 5345 or something like that. And that's how they keep track of where you are when you're flying around. And then, okay, so that's lights, camera, and then action. So I'm checking my trim. I'm checking my wing flaps are at 10. And then I'm bringing in full mixture for maximum power as we're taking off. I'm sorry, my throttle should be idling at 1,000. Again, this is something you would hear, but okay. And so that's lights, camera, action. And now we are coming along. One thing, make sure that this is set correctly. Yeah, okay, so this compass heading should match that. In the sim, it almost always does. In the real world, it sometimes is pretty misaligned, so something to be aware of. All right, so I want to hold on this yellow line the whole taxi through. Folks will sometimes ask what the most useful peripheral is. Like, is it a yoke or a throttle or rudder pedals? And I am a strong believer that rudder pedals are the most useful. So if you're looking for just like one thing to buy to get started with flight simming, you can get some pretty inexpensive rudder pedals that work really well. And the differential braking, the ability to brake on one half versus the other, is really, really nice. So you can brake with just your left toe, for instance, and that lets you pivot the plane. Okay, so this is one of those things where so I'm taxiing up to the actual start of the runway, which is this white bar. And then we can get set up for a takeoff. So our couple of key numbers that we want to be holding in mind for this airplane. So our rotation speed with 10 knots or 10 degrees of flaps is going to be 55. So I'm looking for 55 in the airspeed indicator. I'm going to climb out at VY, which is 74. If we do have any sort of engine problem, then we'll pitch for best glide, which is 60. I think it's 60. Well, it's 68 normally. So best glide is 68. When you have flaps, it changes slightly, but really, if we have a takeoff on short final, I'm going to pitch to 68 and just land the plane. The most important thing with failure on takeoff is just focus on flying the plane, get it down to the ground, just land it. So aviate, navigate, communicate, if you've heard that. We'll talk about that more. Okay. Let's go. So I'm bringing in power. The plane's going to start to roll forward. I advance the throttle over the course of about 4 seconds. And I'm using right rudder here to counteract the left turning tendencies, trying to keep aligned with the center line, watching my airspeed and looking at the runway. Airspeed's alive, which is good. And 55, we want to rotate. And now the other thing I'm looking for, this is where the sim is really different than the real world. I want to keep coordinated flight, so I'm looking for 74 VY. Once I get to a positive rate of climb on the vertical speed and above 200 feet, I'm going to clean up my flaps. So I'll pitch down so you can see. So I'm going to bring my flaps up here. At Palo Alto, we pitch off to the right. So although the runway heading is 310, we pitch to we turn to 320 for noise abatement. So that's a unique thing right here. And then there's a couple things that I'm doing. One is I'm actually mostly using the attitude of the flying. So when I look out the window, my attitude relative to the horizon and also the angle, the picture that I have over the cowling here. So that's why your seat position matters so much. I'm looking for 74 on here. Talk a little bit more about climbing out later. Probably we get a left Dumbarton departure, which means fly out to the Dumbarton Bridge. That's this bridge. And then also there's a nice flightsim.to add-on for that bridge if you're interested in that sort of thing. And for the Bravo airspace that we're going to be coming under here, I want to stay below 2,500 at, I'm sorry, that's out of San Carlos. Let's do this. Okay, so we'll do this how we actually probably would, which is probably get handed off airport to airport. So I want to fly to San Carlos. And so that's that next airport actually is labeled, which is kind of nice. Sorry. Let's go over that away. Good. And I'm going to fly over there at about 2,000 feet. There's a couple of things. Okay, so I'm going to level off at 1,900. Um, and then they would switch me over to San Carlos airspace. And San Carlos is probably going to have me transition their airspace to the west of the 101, which is that highway just off the corner there. So to the west of the 101, and they'll probably say something like at 2000, or maybe they'll give me some other restriction to it. So, okay. And I want to get about 2450 RPM. We can cruise along here. Oops. So what I'm sort of doing here is as I'm trimming the plane up so that I don't need to touch anything for it to keep flying itself. So 1900, I'm now, you can't see my hands, but I am not touching anything on the plane at all. And because I've correctly set the trim, this little wheel here, the plane will just continue to fly as it is. And then another key aspect to think about early on, so now it's starting to climb a little bit, is you want most of your attention when you're VFR flying should be outside of the window. So you want to do about 90% outside and then 10% inside, just cross-checking the instruments. So again, this is one of those things where in real flight, it's a little easier because you would be able to like glance out the side of the window and have a little bit more 360 view on it. But you'd be able to tell like, okay, well, am I relative to the horizon, relative to things going on around me, am I climbing or descending? And then you might glance down and say, okay, sure enough, the vertical speed indicator confirms that. Oops. Okay, so we got San Carlos there. There's 101, so I'm just going to turn around the 101. You can see on the GPS, the airspace for San Carlos is shown, so that's kind of useful. I also have it on my iPad, which I'm using here. Slow the altitude. Okay. So I'm not really liking this bay tour because I would much rather be closer to the 101 than I am on this turn. So the reason that I care about that is that there's mountains right off to the left here. And I don't really like to be this low when I have to deal with those mountains. The other thing is that the airport is in gliding distance right now, but as we move further away, that can be a problem. Okay, so now we're passing San Carlos. That's the San Carlos airport. We'll land there in the end. And they would probably say something like change frequency to San Francisco Tower, and then you switch frequencies, call up the San Francisco Tower, ask them, typically because you would have already told someone at ATC that you're doing a bay tour, they would kind of know what you want. So you just say your position and your end number, just Cessna 12345 or whatever it is. If they're going to allow you in, they'll clear you into the Bravo, and then you can keep flying along. So typically they have you stay below 2,000 feet, depending on the day and how busy it is. So I went flying actually on New Year's Day. It was really pretty in the bay. And so I went out and they restricted me to exactly 2,000 feet the whole way across. And there must have been like 5 or 6 other general aviation VFR aircraft transitioning through at the same time. It was like really, really busy. I mean, they were calling out traffic advisors the whole time. So, all right, so let's say that they restricted us to 2,000. Again, at 2,000, we'll kind of hold the aircraft there. Couple cool things. So over there is the reservoirs. That's the San Andreas fault line is right along the reservoirs. To the right, you can see the San Mateo Bridge, which has an important VP, a visual point for navigation. And then, I don't know why this seems like it's not rendering. Maybe my settings are off, because it seems like my buildings are kind of funky. Usually they look a little better. About that. Okay, oops. Climbed a little bit there. Correcting back down, I'll be at 2000. Okay, so I am now entering the Bravo airspace. One really useful marker in the Bay Area is sort of this. I can't really see it with the way my controls are. Let me see if I can turn back this way. Oops. So I'll try not to climb. So there's that big intersection of highways right there. So that more or less marks the edge of the Bravo, especially when you're leaving from San Carlos, that airport distance back here. So that's one that I'm kind of keeping track of. I also have it on Preflight and also on the map inside the aircraft. So there's a couple of ways to confirm, because we don't want to be breaking the Bravo airspace without permission. Big no-no. Okay. This part's sort of fun, so I'm going to get a little closer. Typically when you fly past SFO, depending on how busy they are, they'll restrict you to south and west of the 101. So again, that's that big highway that's kind of just off to my side here, which gives you a little bit of latitude to fly through it how you want. Oops. This is where, like, flying the sim plane is sort of, it's like touchy in some weird ways. You know, like you in well, anyway, it just, I'm finding myself constantly adjusting this plane, and I think the feel that you get when you get some practice at trimming the airplane is you have the control pressure, and you essentially trim out control pressure. So maybe you're pulling back on the yoke to keep the airplane level, and you would use the trim until you no longer have to pull back at all. And so you can kind of do that double motion, you know, your left hand's holding the yoke while your right hand gets the trim set just right. And you can do it really precisely, really quickly when you can feel the whole thing. But yeah, when it's in the sim, it's like, it's really hard to tell if you actually have the control pressure trimmed out or not. The yoke that I have, which is the honeycomb alpha, I think they call it, is pretty good because it has some pullback to it, so at least I can kind of feel, but pardon my fluctuating view here. Okay, so anyway, south and west of the 101, which essentially allows you to get this incredible view of SFO. And you can see the aircraft landing. They're doing parallel landing on runway 28 off on the side there, which is really fun. Typically, the wind in the bay blows right through this corridor as I start to drift away. So I'm hands off on the controls now, which is good. It means it's pretty well trimmed out. Although I lost a little bit of altitude, so. But typically, this break in the mountains here on the left, you have one and then another, kind of forms this wind funnel, and so the wind is usually in the bay coming right down here. And right across these runways, which is why they're usually taking off in the direction we are currently. Like this guy right there. In the simulated version of this, / people just flying for fun, everyone takes off in all random directions. So, but it's kind of interesting because when you're flying along, every now and then you'll get to watch someone landing or taking off. One other thing that's kind of interesting about SFO, so there's the wind funnel that happens through here. What was I going to say? Well, yeah, I think that's probably all. But one other thing I'll mention is I did get to do a night flight once through here, which was really cool. And essentially what happened was I was one of the only people out. And so they said, the controller for SFO said, do you want to fly over the airport? So this is sort of the view I had of the bay. Right, it was really, really pretty. It was a full moon night. And so I got to fly right over the center of this airport, which is really intriguing. Okay, let me go back to full day and also get back on track before I distracted fly into a mountain here. Okay, so I've sort of deviated from my intended course a little bit, and also got distracted with storytelling, so let me get back up here. Okay, there we go. So again, they probably have us restricted at 2,000. Coming through. If you do use Flight Sim TO, oops, so my throttle. One of the other things that I'm doing periodically as I'm flying is I'm just checking. There's the cross-checking the instruments to make sure that your what you're seeing outside is also reflected in the instruments. So that's one thing. But I'm also occasionally scanning my engine gauges. So, you know, does the oil temperature, oil pressure look good? How am I doing on fuel? Fuel flow, what I'm expecting, is the vacuum in the green, and the amps charging. So, doing a quick scan of those occasionally. Okay. If you fly with Flight Sim TO, Ula VFR has some really good models of these things. You can see all these poles up on the top of the hill. That kind of thing is really, really big in VFR flying, and I really appreciate that project for putting in the effort to go and model all of that. But it is something, you know, you think about crossing this ridge, you know, you can legally do it, but you got to be really wary of the poles that you're going to have and any guy lines that are coming off the sides. So I typically fly out to the coast like this, plus I think it's a better view. So I will look into why my San Francisco downtown looks a little clunky, but now we're coming up to the edge of the Bravo, so typically what they would do... Oops, typically what they would do is say something like, you know, exiting the Bravo in, well, now I'm exiting the Bravo right now, but normally it's say in like 5 miles, contact some new number that'll be NorCal, some new radio frequency. And so then you'd contact them, and depending on where you go on your bay tour, that may be the last person you get handed off to until you come back. Oops, something's going on. Here we go. Sorry, just playing with my adjustments. It's the same sort of thing. It's like none of the feel is there, so I end up having to just like keep tuning it, which isn't great. Really, what you should be doing with visual flying is attitude flying. So like you want to set your power setting, and then you expect to have a certain distance from the horizon to cowling that just is straight and level flight, and you memorize that picture. So the problem that I run into with the flight sim a lot is because I'm constantly doing like this sort of thing to be able to look around and all that kind of stuff. It always looks different, and if the picture is different, then you end up memorizing the wrong thing. So I try to reset myself when I can. Yeah. Anyway, one importance of adjusting your seat when you go flying the other thing. Get that standard picture. Anyway, okay, so Sutro Tower off in the middle there is a pretty famous landmark. If you come and visit San Francisco, you can kind of see it from anywhere. And tell you what, let me see if I can just, if there's something quick with the data that I can do that's going to make the terrain look better. It's set up pretty high. No. I don't know, maybe I'm missing something else. All right, well, if anybody has any suggestions on what might be going on, let me know. Otherwise, I'll do some Googling later to try to figure it out. Okay, so we're coming up on one of my favorite parts of... Oh, at this point, then, we wouldn't be probably restricted anymore, and I typically climb up. We used to under the Bravo shelf, which in this area is 3,000 feet, so I typically climb up to about 2,700. We'll talk about this more the next flight, which is the 4 fundamentals of flight, but again, it's attitude flying, so we pitch up, and then power all the way in, and then pitch up, and then 50 feet before we reach our destination, we want to level off, leave the power in, and then as soon as we accelerate back to our... And then when we accelerate back to our normal cruise speed, then we bring the power back to where we want for. So 2,700, more or less. Hey, Flying Turd. He's one of the other guys who comes to Tuesday night flights. Um, okay, so one of my favorite views of the city is here. So let me see if I can do what you might see out the window, which is there's Golden Gate Park. You can see some of the fields. There's lots of cool things in here. There's some museums in the distance that you can show. And then we're flying over Land's End now, which is a really nice hiking area. It's got some other museums, and then it connects out to this big shoreline. Hey, yeah, no worries. Thanks for joining. Just getting to the Golden Gate Bridge now, so you made it just in time. This is all the Presidio. So, oops, I'm climbing again. One thing I should mention, just for a reality check, if you are someone who likes to do these kind of tours, the amount of chit-chat that happens in an actual bay tour like this is really pretty minimal. Like, I'll point out some pretty key features when there's no one else around that's pulling my focus. And I know a lot about the bay, so I like to talk about it, but the reality is, like, you really got to focus on the flight. So, so my, like, kind of drifting up and down and all that kind of stuff is not, it's really not acceptable, but it's also not part of a normal bay tour, because you as the pilot doing a tour like this, I mean, you're flying the airplane, that is your primary responsibility. But one of the things you do get to do on a bay tour, which is almost always that people have never done this before, is fly over the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is one of my favorite moments and scenes for people, is because they're kind of looking out the window and you got the view of San Francisco there, you can see all the downtown, and then you got the Golden Gate Bridge right below you. This is really fun. Depending on the weather and if there's a lot of people around, sometimes I'll circle back and we can go over a couple of times. Really cool view. Alright, now we're going to Alcatraz, which is this little island here. Check my instruments again. Yeah, so I've lost a little bit of altitude. Normally I stay at about 2,700 for the entire flight, because I want to have options if there's an emergency. But we're in the sim, so I'm going to get a little bit lower, plus we can see Alcatraz a little bit better. One of my favorite parts of the city, actually, is it's labeled Palace of the Fine Arts over there. So I really like that building. This is a cool place to go visit if you're just in town. Just in San Francisco for a little while. And then Alcatraz, the famous prison. When we talk about commercial maneuvers, we can talk about how to actually turn around a point like this. And the 8s on pylons is the name of the maneuver, but essentially what it looks like when you're doing it is it should look like, I'm going to sign this. It should look like your wing is attached to a point in space. Just about at the right altitude for it. And we'll talk about it more then, but it's all about the airspeed you're at and the altitude. And it allows you to turn around a point and keep your wing pointed directly at it. This is a pretty bad example. So yeah, but anyway, just kind of a cool thing. And so those of you who fly on Tuesday, you'll sometimes see me spinning around certain things that we're looking at. So that's actually the same basic maneuver. Yeah, I don't want to jump into it too much, but essentially it's your height above ground relative to your airspeed determines what the radius of that turn will be, and so you can kind of turn around it like that. Okay, so that's, but I would never get this low in the actual bay. 600 feet above the ground, the water is pretty cold. So a couple other things. You can go fly over here. This is Jules joyriding over parts of San Francisco he doesn't actually get to fly this close to. Okay. So typically ATC would also give you an instruction to stay north and north. I think it's north and west of the Bay Bridge is usually how they phrase it. That's this long bridge here that connects up to the island there. Pretty easy to stick to that instruction, and you can still see a lot of cool stuff. Again, you wouldn't get this low in an actual flight, but this is more or less the view you get, which is pretty cool. Okay. I gotta... My 2-year-old dog just moved into the seat behind me. That's cute. Okay. There's the cranes from We Love DFR coming in again. So all right, so I'm gonna start heading back over, and I'll try to get back up to where I should be here. So I'm gonna be climbing at about 90 knots. Again, everything should be based on attitude. So I got full throttle in, and I get the sight picture I'm expecting, and then I'm gonna fine tune it as I actually get flying. So I'm a little too high for a cruise climb. Cruise climb is 90 knots. Okay, and now I'm starting to trim it out a little bit. Still a little high. Okay. And then we'll just climb our way back up. So I'm going to cross over to the Berkeley area. Oops. Got distracted. I was looking at my iPad. Mistake number 1. Okay. So I'm climbing on. Incorrectly said a bunch of these things. Okay, so I'm going to head directly for the Berkeley area, and then we'll turn down probably about this point of the flight. So we're actually in the Oakland, which is, there's Oakland over there, you can kind of see labeled. We're actually in their airspace now. So on a Real Bay tour, I would have stayed further north to avoid just crashing through their Charlie. We'll talk more about airspace later, so I won't go into it further now. But typically at this point, the air traffic controller you're talking with would say something like, you know, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, you know, state intentions, or if they have time, they might give you a more casual, like, you know, what's your plan or something like that. Hello, they're gonna need to say, yeah, yeah. A giant is saying they're gonna need you to copy down a phone number, which is very true. Yeah. Start busting through all these airspaces or erratically flying this close to San Francisco. Okay, so here's the Berkeley area. We're flying over what is actually a pretty nice little park. So that whole area is an off-leash dog park. Fun fact for you. So we've taken our dog running it, which is pretty fun. I believe that's our racehorse track, and then Berkeley downtown is... This is University. I think Berkeley downtown is like kind of right here or so. So for those of you who are interested in that sort of thing. Okay, but they're going to say something to you like, you know, what are you doing next? And because we are going to Oakland, I'm going to say, like to go back to San Carlos with a Oakland transition. And if they can do it, then they'll let you fly through Oakland. If it's really busy at Oakland, or if it's bad weather or something like that, or for any reason really, they may say no, and they may tell you to avoid the class Charlie airspace, in which case we can go all the way back the way we came. That is something to think about if you're taking people on tours and flights. I'm also starting to descend. Oakland almost always tells you to cross the Coliseum at about 2,000. Pending. I'll point out both of those waypoints in just a second so that it means a little bit more, but that's why I'm saying it. But they should have. I don't want to be. So sorry, I'm adjusting my RPM here because I wanted to send it about 2,000 RPM. And I'm just trying to get in the habit of good flying habits for this educational stream. Because again, we're going to do Yeah, the low flying, exactly. Get you in trouble. Okay, so level off here. Oakland's probably going to say fly to the Oakland Coliseum, which shows up in the game a little bit. I believe there's an add-on. Let's see if I can find a... I'll jot a note for later, see if I can find an Oakland Coliseum add-on. But they'll typically say something like, cross the Oakland Coliseum at 2000, and then proceed to the runway 30 numbers. And so literally what they're telling you to do, and I can show real quick, I'll go back to my Mac setup here. So I'm actually back on the flight path that I had originally set. So we kind of did some detours a minute ago just to go fly around. But I'm heading now to a point that I've marked on the map for the Oakland Coliseum. And then they'll typically tell you the 30 numbers. And that's actually the 30 numbers, literally the numbers on the airport of Oakland. So like, that's what they want you to head for when they say that. So I'll go back to aeronautical and turn this off again. But yeah, so that's what I'm doing now. Oops. Distracted flying. Okay. Oh, another tip is if you're flying people, avoid saying oops. Also for your exams, avoid saying oops. Okay. Usually it may be that your instructor or your examiner picked up on your mistake, but passenger often won't have noticed unless you say something, and the examiner sometimes won't have noticed because they may be doing it. Little tip for you. Okay. So, oops, I forgot to point out Oakland downtown. Let me do that real quick. So as we're flying past here, you can see... There's Oakland downtown. I don't know why it's showing up so kind of grimy for me, but normally it renders a lot nicer. I have some feeling like I've got some setting messed up that I gotta go figure out. But anyway, I'll look into that afterwards. This is the Oakland Coliseum, and you can kind of see it looks like a Coliseum. Lost altitude here, so Oakland also has 2 towers. So one tower controls kind of the north side of the airport, the side that we're coming in on. So Oakland has like what is it, 1, 2, 3, 4 runways, so 8 runway directions that you can land. You'll kind of see them as we fly over, but that's why they have two different tower frequencies. So as I round the Coliseum here, he's probably going to tell me something like proceed 30 numbers, then midspan of San Mateo Bridge, which I already have marked in here as and contact other tower frequency, and that's the frequency. All of these things, by the way, you can, and it's a good idea to have written down the frequency to expect. The saying that you'll hear me say a lot in this series, and I think is a really good piece of advice, is the most important thing in aviation, or the 2 most important things in aviation are the next 2 things. And what that means essentially is that what makes you a good pilot, in part at least, is thinking about what's coming next and then doing something to prep for that and kind of anticipating the next 2 things that are going to happen. It's super important with instrument flying, but it's also important just with flying in general. So for instance, before I got to the Coliseum, I would already have, before I went flying, I probably would have written down, or at least had a good access to the tower frequency that I'm expecting. And then by the time I'm getting to the Coliseum, I would have already dialed in what that frequency is going to be here. Because I don't want to be, like, if I can deal with it earlier, I want to deal with it. I don't want to just be always reacting all the time to it. You always want to be anticipating and dealing with it. There's a instructor that I really like. Oops, I lost a little bit of altitude here. There's an instructor I really like who, Rod Machado, if you know his work, I think does a really good job. Okay, let me quick pause. So we're just about to fly over the 30 numbers here. And so they're probably going to tell us something like proceed midspan of the San Mateo Bridge, and descend to 1,400. So this is to avoid the Bravo airspace. You know what I can do actually? It's kind of useful. Let's see if I can get down. Am I gonna hurt myself doing this? Yeah. Okay. So let's get set up and see if I can get this bugged in. So at least we can. Come on. This is one of my least favorite parts of the using the GPS that comes installed by default with these aircraft is like the menus. They're often really similar, but they're not quite the same. Go nearest. So I'm selecting the nearest one. Come on. Good. We'd also need to get the ATIS for the airport that we're going to, so I'm gonna go to the nearest, select it, direct. So this is another thing that's like, anyway, you get good at these certain kinds of flows for it, but then because this thing doesn't quite work the same, it's like, okay, so if I go to flight plan, oh, I can't because it's not correct. All right, whatever, that's fine. I was going to try and show you where the VP mid is on this little map so you can see it, but that's not worth it. That's fine. Well, at least it has bugged up where San Carlos is so we can see. Okay, so I want to be 1,400 as we come to the VP midspan. That's essentially the center of this long, long bridge. You kind of get roughly familiar with it over time, but it's nice to just plug it into the GPS so you have a reference. I try not to get any lower than I need to for this because you're already really low flying over water. So I try to go 1,400. And then at this point, I'll be thinking about the ATIS for San Carlos. So I would have already had that bugged in my secondary radio and then flip on the comm receiver to get the ATIS. I might be able to do it on here real quick just to see what they say. Let's see, nearest airport list. Oops. I don't know that they have ATIS. Oh, they do, okay. So this lets us flip over real quick on here. Essentially, it's telling us wind is calm, altimeter 2992, so that's already what we got bugged in, good. So yeah, same as when we left. We listened to this whole thing through, and then I'm a big advocate for jotting down what you hear on the ATIS. So I have an iPad with a pencil that I use, but also just a notepad and a pen is just fine. Okay, so good, so cruising along. So there's VP min, or VP mid, excuse me. And then we start to turn towards San Carlos, and at this point we probably get handed off to San Carlos. They often tell you something like keep the code. So what keep the code means is, although we're no longer going to be providing traffic advisories to you, we're not going to tell you about other aircraft in the area. We will still watch you, and we know who you are by this squawk code that you have plugged in. So that's what the code, it refers to the squawk code, this 5345. And then San Carlos will also know what that is, so when I call them up, I don't have to tell them much because they already know who I am, where I am, what's going on for the most part. So I'd say something like San Carlos Tower, Cessna Alpha Lima Tango India Sierra, 1,400, midspan San Mateo Bridge, landing, with, and then whatever the information was, which actually I did not write any down. So that's another reason you write it down, but let's see if we can get the information Foxtrot. So say information Foxtrot. And then they'll probably tell me something like, depending on how busy they are, they might send me to a particular waypoint. Often they have me report at the cement plant, or they'll have me at least just go to the cement plant, which is more or less the direction I'm heading now. When we get closer, you might be able to make it out. Oops. And then I typically keep to 1,400 until I get within glide distance of the shore or the airport. And so we're probably close enough now to start bringing power back and start to descend to pattern altitude, which is 800 feet at San Carlos.
San Carlos Airport information, Foxtrot 1700 Zulu. Wind calm. Visibility 9er.
And I'm looking to be descending at about 500 feet per minute. So one of the things I'm looking at is I'm at 2000 RPM, which is the setting that I would usually use for this. There we go. So, but I wasn't coming down, which was surprising me. Now I am. And that's just a nice, gentle descent. Alright. Let's see how well the cement plant shows up. So the nice thing about the cement plant... Yeah, it shows up okay. The nice thing about the cement plant is you can actually make out the ground texture there, so... Like that kind of like... I guess cement color is where the cement plant is, so you can kind of see it from a distance. They might say like report cement plant, or they might just say, you know, head to the cement plant and proceed 30. I'm sorry, 31 for the 30 at San Carlos is 31. Okay, so now as I enter the Palo Alto airspace, I do a GUMPS check. So I'm looking for 5 things. It's just like a quick sanity check to make sure I'm set up to land. Gas, so I'm looking at my fuel gauges, good, and make sure I'm set to the right selector. In this plane, it's both for the whole flight. Gas undercarriage, in this case it's welded. I don't need to lower the gear or anything, but I might check the brakes, so I'll pump the brake ones to make sure that they have some tension in them. Mixture is full rich. Prop, in this case, is fixed, so there's nothing to do with the prop. If we had a prop control here, for constant speed prop, then we would adjust that. Switches, the S is switches and seatbelt, so I'm looking for what lights do I need, are there any other switches that I need in this plane. There's nothing else that needs to be done. And then seatbelts, make sure that everyone has seatbelts on. And that check goes pretty quick, so alright. It would be nice if I flew a full pattern. I'm not going to here, I'm going to just do the landing kind of from where I am, but essentially I'm hitting certain RPM settings at certain, or I'm trying to hit certain speeds and certain flap settings as I come into land, so that my landing procedure looks identical every time. So one of those things that I'll point out real quick, and I'll actually take a pause so I can show you this little highway intersection to the runway. I try to be, there's not actually a power line. I don't think the power line's here in real life. Maybe it's a little further. But anyway, I want to be right about at this intersection at about 500 feet AGL, which is also 500 feet MSL, because it's basically sea level airport. And that gives me then 500 feet up from this distance is a really nice descent into the airport. So that's sort of what I'm looking at is where I am right now. I'm looking for the particular flap setting that I want to use, which I actually need another notch of flaps here. Certain air speeds that I want to hit. So this is my 70 knots is my base speed, so I'm on the base leg. This is all stuff we're going to talk about in future lessons, so if it's totally going over your head, don't worry about it. On a real demo flight, I would just land the plane. I wouldn't probably explain much more. Yeah, okay, but the altitude right now, I'm a little bit above 500, so by the time I get to here, I want to be at 500, but I need to have another notch of flaps on the Oops. There we go. I did the oops again. So there's 500. Got my second notch of flaps. I think my rollout's a little late. Yep, okay, so I missed my turn there, which isn't great. So we'll come back and correct for the center line. I also am getting slow, so I'm constantly glancing at my airspeed indicator just to make sure that I'm not getting slow. On final, I want to be at 65. And, okay, so here we go. About 1500 RPM usually works, the 152. And I have 2 white lights, which is, oops, and I need full flaps. So now I have 2 white lights, which says that I'm high. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to talk about with landing. Unsurprisingly, that is not stuff we can get into right now. But you want to have a white light closer to you, a red light further. That's what I got now. I'm a little slow. And so we pitch for speed, power for altitude on final. So this was not my greatest landing. And then round out and hold off. We want to be on the center line as much as we can. Good. Okay.
VFR aircraft say direction of flight. All aircraft read back hold short instructions.
All right.
Controller on initial contact. You have Foxtrot.
All right. So there were a couple things about that pattern and landing I didn't like. In the real world, we would debrief once we got the plane more out of the way, but I'll just mention them real quick here for anyone who is watching, which is I didn't like when I rolled out onto final. Okay, so I'm going to check down for both planes on both sides. Around, okay. There'd be some tower communication stuff that goes on here. So when I came in to land, so I'm going to stop here, bring the power up to 1,000. And I'm basically doing a cleanup flow, which is a flow that you go through. So trim, mixture for taxi, flaps up, throttle to 1,000, and then clean up your lights. And then you check out if there's any. Then you run your finger over the checklist to make sure that there's nothing else that you need to do. Got everything on here. Okay, good. So when I was coming in, I rolled out onto final too late. And because of that, then I overshot final and I had to come back and correct. Not the end of the world, but sloppy for sure. The other thing was I didn't apply my flaps as I turned final. Because we weren't doing a standard rectangular pattern on the airport, I wasn't paying attention to when I was entering like the distance of a normal base, and so I missed my flaps both on base and final, which were both came in a little later than they should have. And then the last thing was, as I was coming into land, I should have been perfectly aligned with the center line for a nice touchdown, and instead I was a little bit right of center. Touching down straight is the most important thing, but touching down on the center line is really what you're aiming for. All right, so now we'd ask the tower to taxi back to wherever we're going. Since we're at San Carlos, I'm going to taxi back to where the West Valley Plains are at San Carlos, because I happen to know that. Which is so-called North Tower parking. They changed the name of a lot of the features of the airport recently. So, yeah, when I was a student, I studied at San Carlos for most of my private. And when I was a student there, that was Juliet parking. And now it is North Tower parking because the tower is off to there and you're north of the tower. That kind of makes sense.
Temperature 15. Dew point 13. Altimeter 29.902.
Okay, so I'm trying to stay aligned with center line. One thing to mention is your wings are long, and so you should be looking out the window and making sure that you're not going to hit something. There are too many stories about pilots who get into a situation like this, and then they're like, oh, I got to turn around, and they don't think about it, and they just start to turn, and then all of a sudden they're hitting things. So just be conscious of the fact that your wings are really long. It's not like a car. It's got some more break to it. Okay, let's do our cleanup, or sorry, our shutdown list. So again, we want our RPM at 1,000 whenever we're idling. For securing the airplane, parking brake, we can set the parking brake is fine. Electrical equipment, autopilot off. Turn off the strobe. Like I said, I always leave the beacon on. No other electrical equipment. Avionics master switch is off. Magnetos grounding check. So a grounding check we can talk more about later, but essentially we're going to turn the magnetos to off and then back to both. When we turn it to off, we expect the propeller to stop spinning. I don't know what's going to happen in the sim, so we'll find out. Oh, okay. Well, that kind of makes sense. So we'll continue to finish the whole shutdown. Okay, good. So it does stop, but I didn't catch it fast enough. So what would happen is you would hear that the propeller's going to stop, and then you would catch it before it continues. What you're checking for is if you turn it to off and the propeller keeps spinning, you want to know that. So in our case, it did turn to off, which is good. Let's see if I can quickly start it again. Yeah, just, nope. What would I need to do to start this? That's fine. Just to show the rest of the cleaned down or turned down procedure. Okay. So it's on both. Turning it off does shut it off, which is good. Bring the throttle up to 1,200 for shutdown, and then bring the mixture to idle cutoff. So we bring it all the way out. Good. Airplane shuts down. Then we turn the ignition switch off, master off, and then the fuel selector valve. Remember, for fueling, we want to have this on left or right. So we go down here and change this to, it must be possible. Yeah, okay, there we go, to left, or it doesn't matter, one of the two directions, just so there's not crossfeed. All right, and then we would get out, and in the back area, in the storage compartment in the back here, there's a tow bar, so you wrap that around the nose of the plane. Oh, hi guys. uh, we'd wrap that around the front wheel and then kind of push back into the T-bar, which in the base sim, they don't have T-bars. Maybe I'll find a San Carlos model we can use for that. And then you do the tie downs and squawks and logbook. So, all right, look at that. Exactly 1 hour over time, but a nice little flight. Hopefully an informative first lesson. I would say not representative of a demo flight, despite my best intentions. Probably too much talking from my part and not enough of just like letting the student fly around and kind of get a feel for the controls, and really to see if they would enjoy getting their pilot's license. So like I would have done the takeoff and the landing for sure, but once we got up, we'd fly probably just to the west of the airport, and you get to try climbing, descending, turning, just seeing what it's like to fly the plane. Yeah, for sure, Shoots. Thanks for joining. Glad you can make it. And I will do one of these every day for, I actually haven't calculated how many weeks it's going to be, but for a while until we get through the lessons of the private syllabus and the commercial syllabus. So we got several more. And like I said, if you can join, they'll build on each other, which is great. So if you can make it, that's wonderful. If not, I will try to gear them so that they're at least informative, piecemeal, or you can always watch them on Twitch after the fact. And again, if you have any questions that come up later and you want to ask on Discord, is a great way to do it. The link is on my Twitch About page to get to the Discord. Should we put the first part? For sure, yep. Welcome to a Giant. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions on it. It's a lot more kind of looking through the elements of pre-flight and things like that. So it's... yeah, I in my head it would take 45 minutes, but in reality it took an hour and a half. And I think with a real student on a demo flight, it needs to take like 30 minutes max. And so I'm thinking that the thing to do is to have the second lesson maybe go a little more detail. So anyway. All right, cool. Well, great to see you all. Hopefully see you tomorrow, or if not, I'll catch you when I 10. All right, bye.